What if falling asleep was like walking through a quiet Zen garden, each step slower, softer, and more peaceful than the last? This collection of Zen and Buddhist teachings is more than a bedtime ritual, it's a path inward. As the stories unfold, they lead you away from worry and towards stillness. These ancient teachings speak softly, reminding you that the mind can be calm, the body can rest, and peace is always possible. Let the wisdom of the Buddha carry you into a gentle, restful sleep, peaceful breath at a time. The teacup that waited. In a quiet village at the foot of snow-covered hills, there lived an old potter who shaped teacups slowly, as if time itself moved through his hands. Each cup he made felt different, not because of its design, but because of the stillness it seemed to carry. People believed his cups held a silence that could calm even the loudest thoughts. One morning, a young monk arrived from a nearby temple. His eyes were sharp, his breath quick, his voice full of questions. "I want to understand peace," he said. "I've read the sutras, chanted the verses, practiced hard. Still, I feel unsettled." The potter said nothing. He simply handed the monk a half-shaped teacup, damp and cool from the wheel. "Wait with this," he said. "Do nothing, just be here." The monk sat beside the kiln, confused. The air smelled of clay and smoke. He watched the cup in his hands, unsure of what to do. Minutes passed, then hours. At first, his thoughts rushed like a river. He remembered all the things he should be doing, the lessons to review, the tasks he had left behind. But the warmth of the kiln slowly seeped into him. The weight of the cup in his hands became familiar. He noticed how the clay dried along the rim, how the fire's glow moved gently across its surface. His thoughts grew quiet, his breath deepened. The world around him hadn't changed, but he had. By nightfall, the potter returned. The monk sat still, his eyes soft, a faint smile on his lips. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The potter nodded and said gently, "Peace does not arrive when you chase it. It waits, like the teacup, until you are ready to sit still and hold it." Moral of the story: stillness is not a lack of action, it is a quiet unfolding. Like tea steeping in silence, peace reveals itself only when we stop rushing to find it. When we learn to wait, not with impatience, but with presence, the calm we long for gently finds its way to us. The next story is called Moonlight on an Empty Pillow. Long ago, in a remote Zen temple, high in the misty mountains, there lived a monk known for his quiet presence. He spoke little, moved gently, and often slept without even a blanket, claiming the moonlight was enough to keep him warm. Others at the temple found him strange. They whispered about how he seemed untouched by worry, even during times of hardship or long, cold winters. One young novice, struggling with insomnia and a restless mind, became curious. Night after night, he tossed and turned on his thin mat, thoughts racing through his head like wind through dry leaves. He envied the elder monk who seemed to fall into sleep as easily as breathing. One evening, after another sleepless night, the novice approached the old monk. "Why can I not sleep?" he asked. "I chant, I breathe, I lie still, but my mind will not stop moving." The elder looked at him with kind, quiet eyes and said, "Your mind is full because your pillow is not empty." Confused, the novice asked what he meant. The old monk stood, motioned for him to follow, and walked out into the courtyard where the full moon hung quietly in the sky. The night air was crisp, the temple stones cold beneath their feet. The monk pointed to the moonlight spilling through the open window onto his empty bedding. "When I lie down, I leave behind the day. I let go of every word, every thought, every name, even myself. My pillow is not for holding worries. It is only there to rest the head, nothing more." The novice was silent. The moonlight fell across his face, soft and cool. In that still moment, he understood. That night, for the first time in many moons, he slept deeply. Moral of the story. Rest does not come from forcing the mind to be quiet, but from gently letting go. The pillow is not a shelf for worries, it is a place for surrender. When we release the weight of the day and lie down like the sky holds the moon, sleep will come, softly and without effort. The next story is called The Monk Who Spoke to Trees. In a forest monastery far from the noise of cities, there lived a monk who rarely joined the others in conversation. He spent his days walking beneath the tall trees, whispering words no one else could hear. Some thought he was lonely, others thought he was strange. But when asked why he spent so much time in the woods, the monk would simply smile and say, "The trees teach what cannot be taught." There was one young monk who often struggled with anger. His temper flared easily during meditation, during chores, even during mealtimes. No matter how much he tried to follow the teachings, the fire in him would rise without warning. Frustrated with himself, he asked the silent monk for help. Instead of answering, the monk led him deep into the forest. They walked until the monastery could no longer be seen, until the only sounds were birds, wind, and the quiet creak of trees swaying above. Then the monk sat down beneath an old cedar and gestured for the young monk to do the same. They stayed there for hours without speaking. At first, the younger monk grew irritated. What kind of teaching was this? But slowly, something began to shift. He noticed how the trees did not rush, how they bent with the wind but did not break, how they stood without complaint, roots deep in the earth, leaves gently moving in the breeze. Finally, the older monk turned to him and said, "Do you see how the trees do not shout, even when the storm comes? They remain, they feel the wind, but they do not become it." The young monk looked up. For the first time, he truly saw the trees not as just background, but as beings, as teachers, their patience, their steadiness, their quiet strength. That day, something in him softened. He would still feel anger sometimes, but it no longer owned him. He had learned, like the trees, to remain rooted and let the storms pass. Moral of the story. Anger is not something to fight, it is something to understand. Like a tree standing in the wind, we can feel emotion without being blown away. When we root ourselves in awareness and breathe through the storm, calmness will return like sunlight through the branches. The next story is called Echoes Beneath the Lotus Pond. At the edge of a quiet temple stood an old lotus pond. In spring, it bloomed with delicate pink flowers, each one opening slowly in the early morning sun. The pond was still, mirror-like, reflecting the sky and trees with perfect clarity. Yet beneath its calm surface lived stories no one could see, stories carried by the water, the roots, the mud below. A novice monk, young and full of questions, came to the temple seeking answers. He had studied many books, listened to many teachers, but still felt distant from true peace. His thoughts came in wave spheres about the future, memories from the past. No matter how hard he tried to meditate, the ripples of his mind never stilled. One evening, the head monk noticed the novice sitting by the pond, troubled. Without a word, the teacher joined him. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound being the soft buzz of insects and the distant call of an owl. Then the master spoke. "Drop a stone," he said. The novice picked up a small pebble and let it fall into the water. It sank without a trace, but the ripples stretched outward, touching even the farthest lilies. The master nodded. "That is thought. One idea, one worry, and the surface moves. The pond doesn't resist it, allows the ripple, then returns to stillness." He then leaned forward and pointed to the muddy bottom beneath the lotus stems. Below, there is darkness, roots tangled in silence, but from that mud, beauty rises. The lotus does not bloom by escaping the mood, it blooms by growing through it. The novice listened with wide eyes, the water now speaking louder than his own thoughts. He realized that peace wasn't the absence of thought or a perfectly still mind, but an understanding of what lies beneath. That night, he returned to his mat and meditated, not trying to stop his thoughts, but simply letting them ripple and fade like echoes beneath the lotus pond. Moral of the story: peace is not found by avoiding the mind's movements, but by allowing them without resistance. Just as the lotus rises from the mud, clarity grows when we accept our inner depths. Let thoughts ripple, then return to stillness. The beauty lies in what grows from below. The next story is called A Sparrow's Final Question. At the edge of a worn monastery roof, a sparrow built its nest beneath the eaves, just above the meditation hall. Every morning, it sang as the monks chanted, its tiny voice blending with the low hum of prayers. It was old for a bird, its feathers were faded, and its flight had grown slower, but it never missed a sunrise. The monks often smiled at the sparrow, seeing it as a quiet companion to their practice. One monk, in particular, would leave a few grains of rice by the window each day. He was gentle and thoughtful, yet deeply afraid of one thing: death. He feared his last breath, the end of his body, the silence beyond thought. Even in meditation, he felt a tightness in his chest when the idea of dying appeared. He asked the abbot many times how to free himself from this fear, but no answer seemed to help. One cold morning, the monk found the sparrow lying still on the stone path. Its wings were folded, its eyes half open. It had died in the night. A soft sadness rose in him. He gently picked up the tiny body and brought it to the garden, laying it beside a blooming white flower. That evening, the abbot saw him sitting beside the bird, unmoving. He sat beside the monk and said, "You fear death because you see it as an end." But the sparrow asked a question with its silence today: "What really ends?" The monk looked up. "It was here this morning, and now it's not." The abbot nodded slowly. "The body rests, the wings do not rise. But listen, do you hear it? The silence it left behind still sings. The life it touched, the mornings it greeted, the joy it brought that doesn't die. That becomes part of everything." The monk said nothing. He watched the petals flutter beside the still sparrow. That night, for the first time, he closed his eyes without fear, feeling that perhaps nothing truly leaves and changes. Moral of the story: death is not the end, but a soft transformation. Like a sparrow's song fading into morning air, life continues in what it leaves behind. When we stop fearing what we lose and start noticing what remains, peace gently replaces fear. The next story is called The Candle That Refused to Burn Out. In an old mountain temple where winter winds howled through wooden beams, there was a single candle that had been burning for many years. It sat before the statue of the Buddha in the meditation hall, its flame gentle but constant. The monks never replaced it. No matter the season or weather, the candle never flickered, never dimmed. Many visitors came to the temple to see it. Some believed it was a miracle, others a trick. But the monks said nothing. They only bowed to it each morning and sat in silence as the flame lit the darkness. One day, a weary traveler arrived at the temple. His eyes were tired, and his shoulders heavy with sorrow. He had wandered far in search of peace, but found only exhaustion. Seeing the ever-burning candle, he asked the abbot, "How can it keep burning? How can anything last without ending?" The abbot invited him to sit. They watched the candle together as evening fell and shadows stretched long across the floor. "This flame," the abbot said softly, "burns because it does not try to shine. It simply is. It does not fear the wind, nor does it resist the dark. It has let go of needing to last, and so it continues." The traveler didn't understand. "But I try to keep going, to hold on to hope, and still I feel like I'm burning out." The abbot looked at him kindly. "That is because you fight your own flame. You push, you pull, you hold too tightly. True strength comes when you stop struggling and simply let yourself be just as the candle does. When the mind surrenders, its light does not die, it deepens. The temple was silent again. The traveler looked at the flame, small, steady, warm. It did not shine with power, it shone with peace. He stayed in the temple for many days after that, not searching anymore, not forcing anything to change, just sitting, breathing, and slowly remembering the quiet light within him. Moral of the story: peace is not a fire we must feed. It is a flame that grows steady when we stop resisting. When we stop trying to shine and simply allow ourselves to be, our inner light does not burn out, it gently glows, even in the darkest hours. The next story is called Bamboo Dreams in the Windless Valley. Far beyond the noise of footsteps and the clang of temple bells, there was a hidden valley where the wind never blew. It was a place so still that even the leaves on the bamboo stalks forgot how to rustle. This valley was home to a small, ancient hermitage, and within it lived a solitary monk who had not spoken in many years. He had come to the valley after losing everything: his family, his teacher, even his faith. The noise of grief had followed him for a long time, and so he sought the quietest place he could find. In this windless valley, he hoped that without movement, perhaps sorrow would forget him. Each day, he swept the stone path, though no dust ever settled. He lit incense, though no one visited. He brewed tea, though he no longer drank it. He watched the bamboo stand tall and silent, their thin green stalks unmoving even in the deepest hours of the night. But the silence began to do something he hadn't expected. Without wind, the bamboo didn't stop growing. Without noise, his thoughts didn't disappear, but they softened. His memories still came, but like distant clouds, they no longer broke the sky open. One night, he awoke under the full moon and walked barefoot into the bamboo grove. He sat on the cool ground, placed his hand against one of the stalks, and closed his eyes. In the absolute stillness, he could feel it, not movement, not sound, but a kind of silent breathing from the earth below. He realized then that the bamboo did not need the wind to dance. It danced in dreams, in stillness, in the quiet reaching of its roots. He too had grown, though he had not noticed. His sorrow was still there, but it no longer pulled him down. Like the bamboo, he had learned to stand. Years later, when others found the valley and asked him why he stayed so long in silence, he only smiled and said, "The valley taught me to listen, not to the world, but to what grows when nothing else moves." Moral of the story: healing doesn't always come with noise, advice, or action. Sometimes it grows in deep stillness, like bamboo in a windless valley. Even without movement, the soul continues to breathe. In silence, we do not lose ourselves. We return to what was quietly growing all along. The next story is called The Cat Who Slept on Sutras. In a quiet monastery surrounded by pine trees and mountain winds, there lived a small gray cat. She had wandered in one rainy evening and never left. The monks never named her, but she was always there, curled beside incense burners, stretching across stone paths, and most often asleep on the sutra scrolls in the library. At first, the monks were amused. Then, some became annoyed. They saw the cat lying atop sacred texts, resting her head on the words of the Buddha, as if they were simply cushions. Young monks worried it was disrespectful. One of them even tried to move the cat, only for her to return each time, silently and without care. One morning, during a lesson in the Dharma hall, a novice brought up the cat. "Master," he asked, "should we not move her? She sleeps on teachings meant to awaken the mind. Isn't that wrong?" The old teacher looked out the window where the cat now lay, perfectly still, curled like a comma on a stack of open scrolls. He smiled. "Perhaps she understands the sutras better than we do," he said gently. "She rests where our minds still struggle, She feels no need to chase the meaning of words, she simply lies within them. The young monk was puzzled. But isn't understanding the teachings important? Yes, the teacher said, but not just with the mind. Many read the sutras, yet remain restless. She does not read, yet she is at peace. Sometimes the lesson is not in the words, but in how we sit with them. That night, the young monk returned to the library. He didn't move the cat. He sat beside her, scrolls open, breathing slowly. She didn't stir. He didn't read. He simply stayed with the stillness. And for the first time, he felt the sutras not just as words, but as presence. Something quiet opened in him, softer than thought, deeper than explanation. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always come through understanding. Sometimes it comes through stillness, through presence, through simply being with what is. The cat did not chase enlightenment, she rested in it. Peace is not always in the teaching. Often, it is in how we receive it. The next story is called Raindrops That Never Landed. There was once a small monastery nestled high on a cliff where clouds drifted low and soft rain often filled the air. The monks there were known for their deep meditation, sitting quietly for hours, listening to the sound of the world without reacting to it. But among them was a younger monk who struggled deeply with distraction. Every time he tried to sit still, his thoughts would race. Regret from the past, worry for the future, questions without answer swirled like a storm in his mind. One afternoon, a heavy fog rolled into the mountains, and with it came a soft rain. The young monk sat outside beneath a stone overhang, seeking refuge not just from the weather, but from his own thoughts. He watched the sky and noticed something strange. As the mist thickened, the raindrops began to form in the air round, perfect, suspended in front of him, yet never touched the ground. They hovered briefly, then vanished before falling. He leaned forward, fascinated. "Why don't they land?" he whispered to himself. The head monk, who had been sweeping nearby, paused and said quietly, "Not every drop must reach the ground to be complete. Some are meant to rise again." The young monk looked at him, unsure. The elder continued, "Your thoughts are like those raindrops. Some will fall and find meaning. Others will drift, appear, and disappear. You don't need to chase them. Let them come. Let them go." As the rain misted around them, the young monk sat back and did something he hadn't done before. He didn't try to push his thoughts away. He let them appear, like floating raindrops, and then watched them fade. One by one, no pressure, no weight. That day, he began to understand that peace wasn't about having no thoughts, it was about not holding on to them. Moral of the story: not all thoughts are meant to stay. Like raindrops that never touch the ground, some appear only for a moment. When we stop grasping at each one, they pass through us like mist, and in their passing, we discover stillness. Peace is not the absence of thought, but the freedom from needing to follow every drop. The next story is called The Temple Without Walls. In a wide field where wildflowers swayed and birds called out from distant trees, there stood a monk who built no temple. He had no altar, no statue, no roof. Travelers often passed him by, confused to see a man bowing to the sky, sitting cross-legged on the bare earth. Some mocked him. Others asked why he didn't build a proper place to pray. One curious traveler stopped and watched the monk for hours. The monk did nothing special. He sat in silence, drank from a simple bowl, and smiled at the wind. At last, the traveler asked, "Where is your temple?" The monk opened his hands to the horizon. "You're standing in it." "But there are no walls," the traveler said. "No shrine, no gate. How can this be sacred?" The monk looked up at the clouds passing above. "A temple made of stone can fall. A statue can crack. But the temple within the breath, the moment, the heart that never breaks." The traveler frowned. "But don't you feel lonely without chants or rituals?" The monk closed his eyes and listened. Do you hear the bird's song, the rustling grass? That is my chant. The rising sun is my ritual. I bow to the morning light and the stillness of night. Everything is part of the temple if you stop dividing sacred from ordinary. The traveler sat beside him, unsure. But as the wind moved gently through the field and the clouds cast soft shadows over the hills, something shifted. He felt a quiet he hadn't known before, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. No stone, no structure, no noise, just being. He stayed for some time, never asking for more. When he finally left, he bowed not to the monk, but to the empty space that now felt fuller than any room. Moral of the story: peace doesn't always need form. The deepest temple is not built with hands, but with awareness. When we stop looking for sacredness in special places and begin to find it in the air, the breath, the moment we enter a temple that never crumbles, and a peace that never leaves. The next story is called Footprints on the Bell. In a quiet temple where the forest met the edge of the sky, there hung a great bronze bell. It was old, older than any monk who walked the stone paths beneath it. The bell was struck only once, each day at dawn, its deep, trembling sound echoing through valleys and over rivers, waking even the birds from their sleep. But there was something strange about this bell. Etched into its surface, just below the rim, were small footprints, perfectly shaped, like those of a child. No one knew who had left them or how. Some said they were made by accident during casting. Others whispered it was a sign left by a spirit. But the monks accepted them quietly, bowing to the bell each morning, as if those tiny prints held something sacred. One day, a young monk asked the abbot about the footprints. "Why are they there?" he asked, "and why does no one speak of them?" The abbot smiled, as if he had waited a long time for someone to ask. He led the monk to the bell, placed a hand on its cool surface, and said, "Many years ago, there was a child who lived here, an orphan, taken in by the temple. He was too young to chant, too small to serve tea. But each morning he ran barefoot to the bell and pressed his feet against it, waiting for the sound. He said it made the world feel big and soft, and that the echo made his heart stop hurting." The young monk was quiet. The abbot continued. One morning, he was gone. No one knew where he went. But his footprints remained, sealed into the bell's skin. We do not speak of them often, because some things are better honored with silence. That evening, as the bell rang out across the mountains, the young monk closed his eyes. In the echo, he heard something different, a tenderness beneath the sound, a softness wrapped in metal. He knew then that pain, love, and memory could live in the same place. Moral of the story: even silence leaves marks. What touches us deeply does not always need to stay for long. It imprints itself in quiet ways. Like footprints on a bell, love and sorrow leave behind echoes that ring long after the moment has passed. Peace is found in honoring what remains. The next story is called The Silence Between Two Chants. In a small monastery tucked between two rivers, the monks gathered every morning and evening to chant the sacred sutras. Their voices echoed through the valley like soft wind moving over water. The chants brought rhythm to their days, a steady beat of devotion and discipline. But there was one monk who seemed different. He never chanted loudly, and often he would close his eyes before the first word was spoken. Some noticed that his lips barely moved. Yet he always looked more peaceful after the chanting than anyone else. One morning, after the final note faded into stillness, a younger monk approached him. "Why don't you chant with more energy?" he asked. "The words are powerful. You should speak them strongly." The quiet monk smiled. "I do chant," he said, "but I listen more closely to what happens between the words." The younger monk was puzzled. "Between the words? But there is nothing there, just silence." "Exactly," the quiet monk replied. "It is in that silence where I meet myself." That evening, The young monk tried it. As the voices rose and fell, he paid attention not just to the sound, but to what came after each phrase, the brief pause, the still space where nothing was said. At first, it felt empty, like waiting. But soon, he began to feel something within those gaps. The silence was not empty, it was full of breath, of presence, of something softer than sound. It was like watching ripples on water fade back into calm. It was like standing at the edge of a thought before it formed. He began to understand. The chants carried meaning, yes, but the silence carried depth. It was not about the sound itself, but the stillness that made the sound sacred. From that day on, he no longer rushed to speak. He no longer feared quiet moments. He found peace not just in what was said, but in what was gently held between the words. Moral of the story: stillness is where the deepest truths rest. Between every breath, every word, every thought, there is silence, and in that silence lives peace. It is not the sound that heals us, but our willingness to sit with what comes after it. The next story is called Snow That Fell Without Cold. In a high mountain village where winter came early and stayed long, the snow was constant, soft, deep and silent. But one year, during the early days of autumn, something strange happened. Snow began to fall, but there was no cold, no chill in the air, no bite on the skin, no frost on the leaves. It drifted down gently like white petals, covering rooftops and fields, yet melted when touched, leaving nothing behind. The villagers were puzzled. Some said it was a sign of change. Others feared it meant something had gone wrong. But an old monk, who lived alone in a small hut by the forest, simply stepped outside, looked up at the pale sky, and smiled. A young traveler, weary from his journey, had taken shelter in the village. He had been running from heartbreak, from the noise of a life that no longer made sense. He was tired, not just in body, but in soul. Hearing of the monk, he climbed the slope to his hut, hoping to find wisdom or at least a warm place to rest. He told the monk everything about the person he lost, the choices he regretted, the pain he couldn't seem to leave behind. "I carry it like winter," he said, "but it never seems to melt." The monk listened, then pointed to the snow still falling. "Do you feel cold?" "No," the traveler replied. "It's strange. It falls, but it doesn't freeze." The monk nodded. "Some sorrows are like this snow. They appear again and again. But when seen clearly, without fear, without resistance, they do not freeze the heart. They melt as they land." The traveler was quiet. He stepped outside, let the snow touch his skin, and felt nothing. No sting, no burden. Just the soft weight of something already fading. That night, he slept deeply for the first time in many months. And though the snow kept falling, the village was warm. Moral of the story: not all sorrow must be carried. Some grief, when gently welcomed, melts before it can harden. Like snow without cold, pain loses its power when we stop fearing it. Peace comes not by avoiding the falling, but by allowing it to pass through without clinging. The next story is called The Sandalwood Bridge That Led Nowhere. In a mist-covered valley known only to wandering monks, there was once a bridge carved entirely from fragrant sandalwood. It stretched over a small stream that flowed so quietly, it often seemed like still water. But what puzzled travelers most was that the bridge led nowhere. On the other side, there was no path, just a wide field of tall grass and silence. Many came to see it. Some crossed and stood confused, asking, "Where does it go?" Others scoffed, "What is the point of a bridge that leads to nothing?" And yet, monks from distant temples continued to visit, often sitting quietly on its edge for hours, saying little, doing nothing. One day, a young seeker arrived, restless, determined, carrying many questions. He had journeyed far to find meaning, purpose, a direction for his life. When he reached the bridge and saw the empty field beyond, he frowned. "Why build a bridge that leads to nowhere?" he asked aloud. An old monk, seated cross-legged near the stream, opened his eyes slowly and replied, "Because peace lives in the places we stop trying to reach something." The seeker shook his head. "But without a goal, how do we know where to go?" The monk smiled softly. "You've been walking a long time, haven't you? Searching, striving. But have you noticed how tired your mind has become? The bridge is not here to take you somewhere. It is here to show you how to be where you already are." The young man sat down, unsure, still holding the need for answers. The monk gestured to the stream below, where fallen petals floated gently with the current. "Sometimes," he said, "the most sacred path is the one that asks nothing of you, not movement, not progress, just presence." The sandalwood scent drifted through the air. The breeze carried no message, and yet it soothed the heart. The seeker felt something loosen like a knot he didn't know he'd tied. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. He sat there until the sun dipped behind the hills, not waiting for anything, not trying to understand. Just breathing, just being. Moral of the story: not every path must lead somewhere. Some are meant to bring us home to ourselves. When we stop chasing purpose and rest in presence, we discover that peace is not ahead of us, is beneath our feet, in the moment we finally stop. The next story is called The Fisherman Who Caught Clouds. Beside a wide and silent lake, surrounded by mist-covered hills, lived an old fisherman known for his strange habit. He never brought back fish. Each morning, he would take his small wooden boat out onto the still water, carrying no bait, no net, just a single fishing pole with a silver hook and a calm, steady breath. The villagers often laughed behind his back. "He catches nothing," they said. "He must be mad or lost in some dream." Yet every evening he returned with the same gentle smile, as if he had found something greater than fish. One curious boy, full of questions and impatience, approached the old man one morning. "Why do you fish if you never catch anything?" he asked. "What is the point?" The fisherman looked out over the lake, where low clouds hung just above the surface like soft curtains. He pointed toward the sky. "I fish for clouds," he said simply. The boy frowned. "But clouds aren't real. You can't catch them." The fisherman nodded. "Exactly." Still confused, the boy asked to join him. They paddled out in silence. The lake was so still it looked like a second sky. The boy watched the fisherman cast his empty line again and again, patiently, slowly, without expectation. Time passed, but something began to shift. The silence deepened. The boy noticed his breathing slow. The thoughts in his head grew quiet. The clouds above moved without effort, mirrored perfectly on the water. He forgot about the hook. He forgot he was waiting for anything at all. Finally, the fisherman spoke, voice low and kind. "We spend our lives casting lines into the future, hoping for answers, for success, for peace. But sometimes it is enough to sit with the sky, to let the clouds pass, and realize we were never lacking anything at all." The boy said nothing, but as they rowed back, he felt lighter, as if something heavy had floated away. He never laughed at the old man again. Moral of the story: peace is not something to catch, but something to notice. Like clouds reflected in still water, calm appears when we stop reaching and simply sit with what is. Sometimes, the most beautiful things in life are not meant to be held, only witnessed. The next story is called A Bowl of Stars, Left at the Gate. At the edge of a mountainside monastery stood a simple wooden gate. No locks, no guards, just a low archway and a worn stone path leading up to the temple. Near this gate, there was always a small offering bowl. No one knew who placed it there, but each night, without fail, it would be filled not with coins or flowers, but with small, polished stones that shimmered faintly in the moonlight, like stars fallen from the sky. Travelers would stop and look at the bowl. Some thought it a ritual, others thought it meaningless. Many passed by without noticing, but the monks never moved it. They simply bowed gently to it when they entered or left the temple grounds, as if acknowledging something sacred too quiet to speak of. One rainy evening, a tired wanderer arrived at the gate. He had been searching for peace for many years, moving from one teacher to another, carrying the weight of his past like a heavy pack on his back. When he saw the bowl of stones, he scoffed. "Stars don't belong in bowls," he muttered. "What use is this?" An elderly monk tending the path nearby heard him and walked over, his robe soaked at the hem. "Would you like to leave something in the bowl?" he asked. The traveler frowned. "I have nothing of value to offer." The monk smiled kindly. "Then leave your burdens. That is what the bowl is for." The traveler was silent. The rain tapped softly on the leaves above. "But my burdens are not things I can hold," he whispered. "They are regrets, fears, memories. How can I leave them behind?" The monk pointed to the glimmering stones. "Each of us leaves behind a little sorrow, a little longing, a little hope. We do not need to understand how. We just need to be willing to set them down even for a moment." That night, the traveler reached into his cloak and touched nothing at all. Yet, with a quiet breath, he leaned forward and placed his invisible burden in the bowl. And for the first time in years, he stepped through the gate feeling just a little lighter. Moral of the story: letting go doesn't always require knowing how. Sometimes, peace begins when we simply stop carrying what we no longer need. Even the heaviest pain can be placed down in silence. The heart becomes lighter not when we fix everything, but when we allow ourselves to release. The next story is called The Fox and the Fifth Precept. In a dense forest just beyond the farthest edge of a well-known monastery, there lived a fox with eyes like amber and steps as silent as falling leaves. It was said this fox had once been a monk who had broken a vow and been reborn in animal form. Whether myth or truth, no one knew for sure. But the fox appeared often at twilight, sitting just outside the temple gates, watching the monks in silence. Among the temple's 5 guiding precepts, the 5th was the one often whispered about: to avoid intoxicants that cloud the mind. It was a rule many misunderstood. To most, it simply meant not drinking. But to the elders, it meant something deeper: protecting clarity, guarding awareness, preserving the still mirror of the mind. One novice monk struggled with this. He had come to the temple after years of wandering, running from pain he numbed with whatever distractions he could find. Now, though sober in body, his heart still chased escape through stories, fantasies, old regrets, and imagined futures. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, he wandered outside the gate and found the fox sitting alone, its eyes fixed on him. The monk froze, unsure whether to bow or run. But the fox did not move. It simply watched. And somehow, in that gaze, the monk felt all his hiding places vanish. He sat beside it, the two of them cloaked in fading light. He whispered, "I have given up the things that cloud the body, but my mind is still full of fog." The fox blinked slowly, then turned its head to the sound of wind moving gently through bamboo. It listened, still and present. The monk followed its gaze. There was nothing but wind and breath and silence. And in that moment, he understood. The clearest mind is not one that pushes thoughts away, but one that refuses to drink from the cup of illusion. To be fully present, to listen, to bathe the greatest sobriety. Moral of the story: the 5th precept is not just about what we consume, but about what we chase. True clarity comes not from avoiding the world, but from choosing to meet each moment without distortion. Like the fox who sits quietly at the gate, peace waits for those who no longer run. The next story is called The Scroll That Wrote Itself. Deep within a hidden temple nestled among the misty cliffs, there was a single scroll kept in a wooden box wrapped in red silk. Unlike the many sacred texts lining the temple walls, this scroll remained blank. No ink, no symbols, no title, just pure, untouched paper. Yet the monks treated it with the same reverence as the oldest sutras. New monks were often confused. "Why do we honor an empty scroll?" they would ask, but no one would explain. Instead, they were told to meditate beside it for 7 nights in silence. One day, a curious monk, young, sharp-minded, full of ambition, arrived at the temple. He had copied hundreds of scriptures, memorized verses, and studied the words of every master he could find. When he saw the blank scroll, he laughed. What wisdom can be found in nothing? But tradition asked him to sit, so he did. The first night, he sat stiffly, waiting for something to happen. He stared at the scroll, growing frustrated by its emptiness. On the second night, he began to imagine the words he would write, if given the chance. Clever teachings, elegant truths. He filled the blank paper in his mind with his own ideas. By the third night, he grew restless. "What is this silence for?" he whispered. But the scroll remained still, offering no answers. Then came the fourth night, quiet and long. The monk stopped thinking. He stopped imagining. He stopped needing to understand. He simply breathed. On the fifth night, he noticed the rustling of leaves outside the window, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath him. On the sixth night, he sat with no expectation at all. He didn't search for meaning. He felt his breath, the cool air, and the space around him. And on the seventh night, he opened the box one last time. The scroll was still blank, but it no longer felt empty. In its silence, he saw every teaching. He saw that wisdom is not always spoken. Some truths can only be felt, lived, and held gently in the heart. Moral of the story: not all knowledge comes in words. Some truths reveal themselves only when we stop searching, stop writing, and simply listen. The quietest teachings leave no mark on paper, but they leave a lasting imprint on the soul. The next story is called A Zen Garden That Grew in the Sky. High above the clouds, where no path reached and no bird flew, there was said to be a floating garden built, not with soil, but with stillness. The story was almost forgotten, passed down in quiet whispers between temple walls. It told of a Zen master who once grew tired of the noise below, of words, of arguments, of the endless weight of wanting. So one night, without warning, he climbed to the top of the highest peak, bowed to the moon, and vanished. Years later, travelers spoke of strange sighting stones floating mid-air, raked in perfect patterns, moss that never wilted, petals that never fell. The garden, they said, was real, but no one could reach it by foot. It was built not on earth, but in the space beyond thought. In a distant monastery, a young monk became obsessed with this tale. He longed to see the garden in the sky. He trained harder, meditated longer, fasted, studied, chanted, believing that if he worked hard enough, he might rise above the world and glimpse the hidden truth. One evening, frustrated by his failure to lift off, he went to his old teacher. "Why can't I find it?" he asked. "I've done everything. I've emptied myself. I've let go. Why haven't I risen?" The teacher looked at him kindly and said, "You cannot float when you are still climbing. The garden is not above you. It grows where striving ends." That night, the monk sat in silence. He stopped chasing, stopped reaching, stopped trying to rise. He listened to his breath. He noticed the sound of a single cricket outside. He felt the ground beneath him not as a prison, but as peace. And then, without leaving his cushion, he saw it. Not with his eyes, but with his whole being. The raked stones, the blooming stillness, the weightless calm. The Zen garden had never been in the sky. It had always grown in the space left behind when wanting disappeared. Moral of the story: peace is not something to climb toward. It is something that appears when you stop climbing. The Zen garden grows not in the clouds, but in the open space of a mind no longer searching. When we stop reaching, we rise. The next story is called A Zen Garden That Grew in the Sky. High above the clouds, where mountaintops disappeared into mist and silence ruled the sky, there was said to be a garden that no one had ever walked through, yet many had seen in dreams. It had no soil, no fences, no pathonly stones arranged in floating patterns and raked lines drawn into air itself. An old monk once spoke of this garden, not as a legend, but as something real. He claimed it could only be reached in a certain state of mind, not by climbing, but by letting go. It's not built on earth, he would say, but on the stillness that rises when the world is no longer heavy. A young monk, always questioning, asked how to find such a place. "I meditate," he said. "I chant, I follow every rule, yet I feel stuck. How can I rise?" The old monk led him to the monastery's own small rock garden, just a patch of sand and stone tucked in the corner of the temple. There, he gave the younger monk a simple task: to rake the sand each morning before the sun rose, and again each night before sleeping. The young monk obeyed, though the task seemed too small to matter. Day after day, he traced the same circles around the same stones. At first, he grew bored, but with time, the lines grew smoother. His breath began to match the movement of his hands. Thoughts slowed. Silence returned, and without noticing, he began to feel weightless. One morning, after many weeks, he looked up from the sand and saw the sky shimmering. The stones before him seemed to float. The raked lines moved with the clouds. It lasted only a moment, but in that instant he knew. The garden in the sky had never been elsewhere. It had grown in him. Moral of the story: heaven is not a place above it is the peace that rises when the mind becomes light. When we let go of restlessness and meet each moment with quiet care, we begin to see beauty that was always present. The Zen garden in the sky is the reflection of a still and open heart. The next story is called The Robe Sown with Sunlight. There once lived a humble monk who wandered from village to village with nothing but a begging bowl, a smile, and a robe that shimmered softly in the morning light. It was unlike any robe the villagers had ever seen, not because it was decorated or expensive, but because it seemed to carry warmth, like dawn held in cloth. Children reached out to touch it, and even the weariest travelers paused when he passed, as though sunlight followed behind him. Many believed the robe was magical, but when asked, the monk would simply say, "It was sown with sunlight and silence." One day, a young woman approached him. Her father was dying, and grief had made her heart cold. "How can you walk with peace when the world holds so much sorrow?" she asked. "How can your robe shine when everything feels so heavy?" The monk sat with her beneath a tree and began to tell the story of the robe. Years ago, he had been a different man, angry, proud, full of hurt. His mind was dark, and his heart closed. After great loss, he retreated to a forest and lived alone. Each morning, instead of weeping, he gathered fallen leaves. Each day, he listened to birds. Each evening, he sat in silence and watched the sun fall behind the trees. He did this for years, saying nothing, just letting the light return to him bit by bit. One winter, he began to sew a robe using threads he carried with him. As he stitched, he thought only of warmth, of forgiveness, of gentleness. With each thread, he let go of something he no longer needed: anger, guilt, fear. By spring, the robe was complete. It wasn't magic, it was memory, softened into light. The young woman wept, and the monk wrapped the robe around her shoulders. Though it was just fabric, she felt its warmth. Moral of the story: Peace is something we weave, thread by thread, through stillness and healing. What shines in another is not mystery, it is the result of quiet transformation. When we let go of pain and welcome light, even what we wear begins to carry the sun. The next story is called The Dream of the Stone Buddha. In the center of an ancient village stood a giant stone Buddha, carved from a single mountain rock. It had no color, no gold leaf, no ornaments, only soft features shaped by time and wind. The villagers passed it every day, bowing quickly, often out of habit. It had stood there for so long that no one truly looked at it anymore. It had become part of the background, like the trees or the sky. But deep within that cold, unmoving statue, there was a dream, not one shaped by mind or thought, but a quiet longing pressed into stone itself. The Buddha, though made of rock, dreamed of motion, not to move through the world, but to touch a heart. It dreamed of being seen, not with eyes, but with stillness. One day, a traveler arrived, worn sandals, tired shoulders, eyes searching for something he could not name. He had wandered for years, chasing teachings, collecting mantras, visiting temples with jeweled statues and chanting crowds, but none had eased the ache he carried. When he saw the stone Buddha, he almost passed by. There was nothing special about it, no incense, no monks, just silence, but something made him stop. Perhaps it was the way the Buddha faced the sunrise, as if it remembered light, or maybe it was the way moss had grown along its base, as if even the earth leaned in to listen. He sat down, too tired to ask more questions, too empty to hope. He closed his eyes, not to meditate, but to rest. Minutes passed, then hours, then something shifted. He felt it, not a sound, not a voice, but a weightless presence, a stillness that wrapped around him like breath. It didn't tell him anything, it didn't promise peace, it just was. And in that deep, shared stillness, the stone Buddha's dream was fulfilled, not by moving, but by being fully met. Moral of the story: sometimes what we seek is not hidden, it is simply quiet. Like the stone Buddha, peace does not chase us. It waits patiently for the moment we stop running. True connection happens not when we find something new, but when we finally pause long enough to be touched by what has always been there. The next story is called The Inkwell of Emptiness. Long ago, in a remote monastery nestled between rivers and stone, there was a calligrapher monk who wrote the sacred sutras by hand. His brush strokes were known far and wide, not for their beauty, but for the peace they seemed to carry. People said you could feel calm just by looking at the words he painted. One day, a young monk arrived to study under him. This student was eager, full of ambition, and wanted to master the art of calligraphy quickly. He practiced day and night, but his brushwork was stiff, rushed, and filled with frustration. "Why do your characters feel alive?" the student asked, "while mine look like shadows of meaning?" The old monk smiled gently and handed him an old black inkwell. "This has been empty for years," he said. "Try writing with it." The student frowned but obeyed. He dipped his brush, expecting nothing. Yet when he touched it to paper, faint strokes appeared, soft, light, barely visible. But there was something about them. They looked free, gentle, unburdened. "How is this possible?" he asked. "There's no ink." The calligrapher replied, "That's because you finally stopped trying to impress the page. You wrote without self, without pressure, without noise." He placed the inkwell in the student's hand. This is the inkwell of emptiness. It reminds us that meaning is not always in what we add, but in what we allow. True writing, like true peace, begins when the self disappears. The student said nothing. He looked at the faint lines he had drawn, then at the space around them. It was not the black ink that mattered, it was the silence between the strokes, the breath behind the motion. That night, for the first time, he wrote not to create, but to feel. His heart was still, and the brush moved like wind through tall grassoft, natural, alive. Moral of the story: emptiness is not absence, it is space, potential, and quiet freedom. When we stop trying to force meaning, it begins to arise on its own. Like ink that flows from an empty well, peace comes when the self softens and the moment is allowed to speak for itself. The next story is called The Gate That Opens Inward. At the edge of a wind-swept plain, where grasses danced like waves and the sky stretched endlessly, there stood a strange wooden gate. It was not attached to any fence or wall. It stood alone, weathered, silent, always closed. Travelers often passed it by, puzzled. Some tried to open it, but no matter how hard they pushed, it would not move. A few laughed at it, others dismissed it as broken or symbolic. But one day, a wandering monk came upon the gate and simply stood before it. He placed his hand gently on the worn wood, not with force, but with quiet curiosity. He whispered, "What are you keeping in? Or what are you keeping out?" The wind blew softly. The gate did nothing. The monk sat down before it, not to solve a puzzle, but to listen. He watched the shifting clouds. He noticed how the grasses bent with the breeze. He felt the weight of his breath and the stillness between each thought. After some time, an old woman came walking from the nearby hills. She had seen many come and go, all trying to force the gate open. She saw the monk sitting, eyes soft, and said, "You haven't tried to open it." The monk smiled. "Perhaps it does not open the way we think." The woman nodded and walked past him. Then, as if revealing a long-forgotten truth, she turned and said, "It opens inward." The monk stood. He placed his hand again on the gate, this time pulling gently toward himself. With a quiet creak, it opened easily, effortlessly. Behind it was not another place, not a path or a secret garden. There was only space, the same field, the same sky. But everything felt different. The monk stepped through, not into somewhere new, but into the moment itself with new eyes, with no resistance. Moral of the story: the obstacles we face often feel immovable because we push against them. But true peace does not come by force. It comes by turning inward. Like the gate, the answers we seek are not beyond us. They open when we return to ourselves. What we push away may simply be waiting to be received. The next story is called When the Wind Forgot to Move. In a quiet valley where the grasses swayed endlessly in the breeze, people told stories about the wind as if it were a living spirit. It came each day without fail, whistling through bamboo, stirring petals from the trees, and filling the monks' robes like sails during walking meditation. The wind was part of everything. It whispered through sutras, danced on tea steam, and cooled even the warmest afternoons. But one morning, something unusual happened. The wind didn't come. The trees stood still. The grass did not bend. The prayer flags hung motionless. It was as if the breath of the earth had stopped. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was thick and strange, like a held breath that had gone on too long. At the temple, the monks gathered, unsure. Some worried. Others meditated harder, hoping their calm would bring it back. But one old monk simply sat in the courtyard, eyes closed, hands folded in his lap. When asked if he was worried, he smiled and said, "The wind hasn't gone. It is resting." A younger monk sat beside him and whispered, "But everything feels different without it. I feel empty." The old monk nodded. "Yes, but sometimes emptiness is how we remember fullness. When the wind moves, we never stop to notice it. But now, in its stillness, we understand how much it carries us." As the hours passed, the stillness deepened. The young monk began to notice things he had never paid attention to before: the creak of wood beneath the bench, the tiny flicker of a moth's wings, the way his own breath moved quietly in and out. By nightfall, the wind had not returned. But something in him had shifted. The silence no longer felt empty, it felt complete. And just before dawn, as the first light touched the tops of the trees, a soft breeze returned. It rustled a single leaf, barely enough to hear, but that one sound brought tears to his eyes. Moral of the story: we only notice what carries us when it is gone. Stillness teaches appreciation. When the wind forgets to move, we are invited to meet ourselves in the quiet. Peace is not just in what flows, but in what pauses, gently asking us to listen. The next story is called A Bell Rung in Silence. In a small temple built between two cliffs, where sunlight arrived late and wind carried the scent of pine, there hung a bell that was never struck. It was large and beautifully cast, with carvings of cranes in flight and waves curling around its base. Yet it made no sound. The monks who lived there followed a practice few understood, meditating beside the bell but never ringing it. Travelers would visit and ask, "Why have a bell you never use?" And the monks would only smile. "It is not meant for sound," they'd say. "It is meant for listening." One day, a young monk arrived at the temple, troubled and full of noise inside. His thoughts were fast, his heart restless. Every silence felt loud to him. Every pause made him feel lost. He noticed the bell on his first morning and couldn't stop thinking about it. "Surely sound brings clarity," he said to himself. "A bell is made to ring. Why keep it quiet?" Days passed, and his questions grew heavier. Finally, one night, when all others had gone to sleep, he stood before the bell and raised the wooden striker. The air was cool, the moon high. His hands trembled. He struck the balancé firmly. The sound was deep and powerful. It echoed across the cliffs, rolled through the trees, and seemed to shake the stars themselves. It was beautiful, but the silence that followed was even deeper. In that vast, open stillness, something shifted. He felt his heartbeat. He felt the edge of his thoughts. He felt everything. The next morning, he approached the head monk and confessed. The elder simply nodded. "Now you've heard it," he said. "The bell does not ring for sound, it rings for what follows." The young monk began to understand. After that, he sat beside the bell each day, no longer tempted to strike it, but listening for what it had shown him, the truth between sounds, the stillness after action, the peace that follows letting go. Moral of the story: sometimes the most powerful moments come not from noise, but from what happens after it fades. Like a bell rung in silence, peace is not the sound, it is the space it leaves behind. When we stop seeking more, we begin to truly hear. The next story is called The Cloud That Lost Its Name. There was once a cloud who floated high above the world, soft and full, always shifting in shape. Sometimes it looked like a dragon, other times a sailboat, a flower, or a sleeping child. People below would point and give it names. "Look, a lion. Now it's a feather. It's turning into a heart." The cloud listened to them all. At first, it felt proud. It liked being noticed, being shaped by others' eyes. But as time passed, it began to wonder, what was it really? Was it a bird, a horse, a story? If everyone called it something different, did it have a true form, a true name? One day, the cloud stopped moving. It hovered alone in a quiet patch of sky and whispered to the wind, "What am I, really?" The wind didn't answer. It simply blew gently, as always, carrying the cloud onward. The cloud grew anxious. "If I have no name, do I even exist?" it asked the sun. The sun warmed it with silence. Then, slowly, the cloud began to dissolve. A part of it turned to mist, another to rain. Some of it drifted away into the blue. And still, it didn't know its name. A small child standing by a rice field looked up and smiled. as the raindrops kissed her hands. "Thank you, cloud," she whispered, though it was already gone. Far above, the bits of cloud scattered became part of rivers, fog, even breath. It had no shape now, no title, but it was everywhere. And in that formlessness, it found peace. Moral of the story: we are not the names others give us. We are not even the names we give ourselves. Like a cloud, we are always changing, softening, shifting, dissolving into something greater. Peace comes not from holding tightly to identity, but from letting go of the need to be defined. In namelessness, we return to truth. The next story is called Beneath the Sleeping Banyan. At the edge of an old village, where time moved slowly and the air always carried the scent of earth, stood a great banyan tree. Its branches stretched wide like 100 arms embracing the sky, and its roots wove in and out of the ground like ancient veins. The villagers called it the Sleeping Banyan, because no matter the season, it seemed to rest, unmoved by wind, untouched by change. Beneath its vast canopy sat an elderly monk, day after day, from sunrise to dusk. He rarely spoke. He watched the birds land and leave. He watched shadows stretch and fade. People would pass by, greet him, and sometimes sit nearby, but he never seemed to notice them. His presence was like the trees, quiet, deep, and still. One afternoon, a boy sat beside him, legs crossed, face full of questions. "Why do you sit here every day?" he asked. "You don't chant, you don't move, you don't even close your eyes." The monk looked at him for a long moment, then pointed down at the roots curling over the soil. "Do you see these?" he said. "They grow slowly, so slowly you'll never see them move, but they hold the whole tree in place." The boy frowned. "But how do you know they're growing if you can't see them change?" The monk smiled. "I don't need to see the growth, I feel it." He placed his palm on the warm ground. Peace is like that. You don't always notice it. It doesn't shout, it doesn't shine. But if you're still long enough, it grows beneath you quietly, holding you steady. The boy sat for a while longer, trying to be still, listening to the wind move through the leaves. He didn't feel anything special, but somehow he didn't want to leave. Years later, he would return as a grown man, and without a word, sit beneath the same tree, no longer looking for something, but simply being there, like a root no one could see. Moral of the story: true peace grows slowly, deep beneath the surface. Like the roots of a great tree, its strength is not always visible, but it steadies us in silence. When we stop searching for quick signs and sit with the stillness, we begin to feel what holds us. The next story is called The Mirror That Reflected the Future. In a secluded mountain temple, hidden behind layers of pine and cloud, there was said to be a mirror unlike any other. It was kept in the inner sanctum, untouched by dust or time. The monks who lived there whispered that it did not reflect the present, the past, but the future. Pilgrims came from far away, hoping to glimpse what lay ahead: success, love, wisdom, or warnings. But when they stood before the mirror, all they saw was their own faceplane, silent, unchanged. Most left confused or disappointed, saying the mirror was only ordinary glass. One day, a troubled monk approached it. He was young, but already weary. Fear of failure haunted him. He felt lost in his practice, unsure if he would ever find peace. "If I knew my future," he thought, "I might rest. I might trust this path." He stood before the mirror with a quiet heart, expecting nothing. At first, he saw only his reflection, his tired eyes, his uneven breath, the small tension in his brow. But as he kept looking, something strange began to happen. He saw himself as he was now, but slowly, the image softened. Not changed by age or achievement, but by stillness. His face looked more open, the breath calmer, the eyes clear. There was no robe of gold, no grand title, just a man sitting in quiet, with no fear left in him. The monk felt tears rise. It wasn't a vision of fame or answers. It was a future where he no longer resisted his own life. An elder entered and stood beside him. "The mirror does not lie," he said gently. "It shows the future that appears when you stop trying to control it. When you meet yourself fully, without fear or pretending, that is the path that unfolds." The young monk bowed, not to the mirror, but to himself. And as he walked away, he no longer needed to know what was coming. It was enough to meet what was here. Moral of the story: the future is not a fixed picture waiting to appear. It is shaped by how we see the present. When we stop looking ahead in fear and begin facing ourselves with honesty, peace takes root. The clearest path forward begins with a single still moment of presence. The next story is called The Owl Who Meditated at Dusk. In a dense forest where sunbeams filtered through the trees like strands of gold, there lived an owl who never flew by day. While other creatures rushed through daylight hours gathering, building, calling out, this owl waited quietly in her hollow, eyes half closed, breathing slowly. She emerged only at dusk, when the light softened and the world began to exhale. The animals often wondered why she chose such a strange time to move. "Why not enjoy the sun?" the deer asked. "Why not sing with the birds?" the squirrels chimed in. But the owl only blinked, calm and still, as if she saw something they did not. At the edge of the forest was a small hermitage where a monk had lived alone for many years. His robes were worn, his voice gentle, and his footsteps always mindful. Each evening at dusk, he would sit beneath a tall cedar tree and enter his meditation. And always, just before the sky turned completely dark, the owl would arrive, landing quietly on a low branch above him. She never made a sound, yet every evening she came. One day, a young student arrived to study with the monk. Eager and full of energy, the student asked many questions, read many sutras, and practiced throughout the day. But when dusk came, he would stop and grow restless. "Why meditate when everything grows dark?" he asked. "Isn't light better for awareness?" The monk smiled and pointed to the owl, watching from her branch. "She sees in the dark," he said, "not because she chases light, but because she trusts the shadows." The student was silent. That evening, he sat beside the monk and closed his eyes. At first, it felt uncomfortable, the darkness, the quiet. But slowly, he began to hear more. The rustle of leaves, the breath of wind, his own heartbeat. And above him, the owl remained still, keeping her silent vigil. From then on, he too meditated at dusk, not to escape the darkness, but to meet it. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always shine. Sometimes it waits in shadows. Like the owl, peace sees clearly not by avoiding the dark, but by being still enough to feel what light cannot show. In dusk, in silence, the deepest truths are revealed. The next story is called Lanterns for the Invisible River. In a village where no river could be seen, there was a strange custom held once a year. On the night of the new moon, every person, young and old, would gather at the foot of the hills and release lanterns into the empty air. They called it the river ceremony. Lanterns floated through the dark fields, drifting in silence, as if carried by water that no one could touch or trace. Travelers laughed at the practice. "There is no river," they said. "Why do you light the way for what isn't there?" But the villagers only smiled and continued their quiet ritual. One year, a wandering monk passed through the village just before the ceremony. He had been walking for months, searching for peace after losing someone he loved. Though kind and gentle on the outside, his heart was dry, like cracked earth. He felt nothing, not joy, not sorrow, only silence, and not the good kind. Curious, he stayed to watch the ceremony. A small girl offered him a lantern and said, You have to name what it's for before you let it go." He hesitated. "But I have nothing to name." She looked up at him with wide eyes. "You can still light it." As night fell, the villagers gathered. One by one, they lit their lanterns, some for healing, some for forgiveness, some for dreams not yet born. The monk stood among them, holding his lantern close. In the silence, something shifted. He whispered the name he had not spoken in many months. Then he let go. The lantern rose into the night, joining 1,000 others. And for the first time, he felt a current move through him, not of water, but of grief, flowing gently into acceptance. There was no river, but there was release. And in that invisible stream, something within him began to soften and move again. Moral of the story: not all rivers are made of water. Some flow through memory, through longing, through hope. We light lanterns not to see the path, but to honor the unseen journey. Peace often begins when we let go into what cannot be touchedly felt. The next story is called The Monk Who Fed Shadows. In a valley where the sun rarely stayed long and mist curled like breath between the trees, there was a monastery known for its unusual rule: no lamp was ever lit after dusk. When night came, the monks walked by memory and moonlight, letting the dark teach them what the day could not. Among them lived an old monk who had once lived a different life, one full of riches, noise, and endless distractions. He had arrived at the monastery with heavy burdens and a heart that avoided silence. But over the years, he had become known not for his past, but for a quiet practice few understood. Each evening, just after the sun dipped below the hills, he would sit at the edge of the meditation hall and place a small wooden bowl on the floor. Into it, he would scoop a portion of rice, sometimes fruit, sometimes only water. Then, without speaking, he would bow and leave the bowl where the moonlight touched the shadows. One young monk watched him each night, puzzled. "Why do you offer food where no one eats?" he finally asked. "There's nothing in the dark." The old monk looked into the trees, eyes soft. "That is where the hungriest parts of us live," he said. "Not in the light, but in the places we pretend not to see." He explained that when he first arrived, he was haunted by regret-old memories, unkind words, choices he couldn't undo. They visited him like shadows at night. So instead of running, he offered them kindness, a bowl, a gesture, an acknowledgement. "They stopped chasing me," he said. "Not because I defeated them, but because I fed them." The young monk was quiet, unsure what to believe. But that night, he too left a small offering at the edge of darkness. He did not know what it was for, only that it felt right. And slowly, over time, the shadows seemed softer. They no longer followed him. They simply watched, then passed. Moral of the story: the parts of us we fear are not enemies. They are wounds waiting to be seen. When we meet our shadows with compassion instead of resistance, they lose their sharpness. Peace does not come from fighting the dark, but from feeding it gently until it no longer feels hungry. The next story is called The Girl Who Spoke in Koans. In a village not far from the mountains, where rice fields shimmered in the sun and wind swept through tall grass like breath over silk, there lived a little girl who spoke in riddles. Her words puzzled even the elders. When asked a question, she would answer with something strange and soft. "The moon wears sandals," or "silence is louder when it's raining." Many thought she was simply odd, lost in her own world. But the nearby temple's head monk, old and wise, noticed something different. Each time she spoke, it stirred something in him like a bell ringing where no bell could be seen. One day, a traveling monk arrived at the village. He had studied under many masters and carried a thick journal filled with teachings. Yet still, he felt no peace. His thoughts were sharp, always slicing meaning into pieces, always searching for more. He heard of the strange girl and, out of curiosity, went to visit her. He found her by a pond, tossing stones into the water. "Little one," he said, "tell me what is enlightenment." She didn't look up. She simply said, "It is the sound of a frog jumping in before you hear the splash." The monk blinked, confused. "That makes no sense," he muttered. "Is it a joke?" She smiled softly and said, "Do you need sense to stop thinking?" Frustrated, he turned to leave, but something in her voice echoed. That night he couldn't sleep. Her words repeated in his mind, not as a puzzle, but like the wind brushing against an unopened door. Days passed. He stayed in the village, watching her, listening. Each phrase she spoke was like a koanat to be solved, but to be felt. Slowly, his need for answers dissolved. His thoughts grew quiet. The journal he once clung to remained closed. One morning, while walking alone, he heard a frog leap into a pond. No one spoke, no one explained, and in that perfect passing momentha smiled. Moral of the story: not all wisdom speaks clearly. Some truths are meant to shake the mind, not comfort it. Koans are not riddles to solve, but mirrors that show us where logic ends and awareness begins. Peace arrives when we stop searching for meaning and start listening beyond it. The next story is called When the Sutras Dissolved in Rain. At a secluded temple perched on a green hillside, the monks practiced a simple but devoted ritual. Each morning, before the sun crested the trees, they would carry sacred sutra chant written on delicate rice paper outside to chant beside a stream. These ancient texts were copied by hand, each word carefully inked with quiet reverence. The pages were precious, preserved in silk-wrapped scrolls passed down from master to student. One season, the rains came early and hard. Day after day, thick clouds blanketed the sky, and the forest around the temple grew heavy with mist. One morning, a new monk, eager to follow tradition, took the sutras outside to begin chanting despite the drizzle. As he unrolled them, a strong wind came and blew a fine rain across the pages. In moments, the ink began to smear. Lines blurred, letters faded. Before he could stop it, half the sutra had vanished into water. His breath caught. Panic rose in his chest. He gathered the damp scroll and rushed to the abbot, voice shaking with shame. "Master, I've ruined the teaching," he said. "The sutras, they're gone." The abbot took the scroll gently in his hands, examined the dripping paper, and sat down beneath the temple's eaves. "Sit," he said. The rain continued to fall softly around them. The abbot held the scroll in his lap and closed his eyes. After a long silence, he said, "The teaching was never in the ink." The young monk stared at him. "But we spent years copying these words. They were sacred." The abbot nodded. "Yes, sacred, but not because they lasted. The sutras are like the rain. Their truth is not in how long they stay, but in what they nourish while they pass." Together they watched the rain soak the earth, feeding the roots of trees, merging with the stream. The young monk understood then. The teachings lived not in symbols, but in the heart they stirred. What dissolves is not lost, it returns. Moral of the story: wisdom is not held by words alone. Like rain on ink, life washes away even what we think is permanent. But when the heart listens deeply, the teachings remain. Peace comes when we let go of form and trust what flows beneath it. The next story is called The Pillow Made of Wishes. In a dusty corner of a village tea shop, hidden beneath layers of quiet and time, there was an old pillow said to hold the dreams of everyone who had ever rested their head upon it. Worn thin by countless nights, it was filled not with feathers, but with tiny folded scraps of paper, each one holding a wish whispered into it before sleep. No one knew who made the pillow. Some said it had been passed down through generations. Others believed a wandering monk left it behind after a night of deep rest. But everyone who used it said the same thing: The sleep it gave was soft, like falling into a warm breeze, and when they woke, their hearts felt a little lighter even if their wish hadn't come true. One day, a boy arrived at the tea shop. He was quiet, carrying sorrow too large for his small frame. His mother had recently passed, and sleep no longer came to him. Each night, he stared at the ceiling, his mind a storm of memories and questions. Where did she go? Why did things end? Would the sadness ever stop? The shopkeeper, an old woman with gentle eyes, handed him the pillow. "Write your wish," she said, "just once, then sleep." The boy didn't ask questions. He simply took a small slip of paper and wrote, "Please let me see her in my dreams." That night, he rested his head on the strange, lumpy pillow. He didn't dream, but he slept deeply, quietly, without waking. When morning came, the ache in his chest was still there, but something had softened. He continued to sleep with the pillow for many nights. He didn't always write a new wish. Sometimes he just held it, knowing it held the hopes of others too. And in time, he began to notice his mother's voice in the rustle of leaves, her laugh in a bird's call, her warmth in sunlight touching his cheek. He never saw her in a dream, but he began to feel her everywhere. Moral of the story: wishes do not always bring what we ask for, but when we let them go with honesty and love, they return in unexpected ways. Peace is not in the wish itself, but in the heart that dares to whisper "I tand," the sleep that follows when we surrender to the softness of letting go. The next story is called The Whisper Under the Altar. In a forgotten monastery hidden behind moss-covered cliffs, there stood an altar unlike any other. It was small, carved from dark wood, and set low to the ground as if inviting humility. No gold adorned it, no relics were displayed, only a single stone bowl filled with water and a folded cloth resting beside it. The monks who tended this place were few, and none spoke of the altar's origin. They bowed before it daily, but never explained why. To visitors, it seemed plain too simple to hold anything sacred. Yet whenever someone knelt before it, they often found tears in their eyes without knowing why. One evening, during a storm that rattled the mountains and shook the windows, a young monk stayed behind after evening chants. He had been struggling in silence for months, feeling numb in his practice, uncertain of his path. He had memorized sutras, followed every form, but his heart remained untouched. As thunder echoed beyond the walls, he approached the altar and sat in stillness. The flickering candle cast shadows that danced along the walls. The room felt heavy, like something was waiting to be heard. He leaned forward and rested his forehead gently against the base of the altar. And in that moment, he heard it. A whisper, not with his ears, but somewhere inside. It wasn't a voice or a sentence. It was more like a feeling, a soft current of warmth, as if someone long gone was still listening. He did not try to understand it. He didn't ask questions. He just breathed. Later, the abbot found him still seated, eyes closed, face wet with quiet tears. He said nothing, only placed a hand on the young monk's shoulder. "That altar," the abbot said softly, "was built by one who never spoke again. He poured everything he had into its silence. Some things are too sacred for words, but not too sacred to be felt." The young monk nodded, heart strangely lighter. The silence he feared had become something else. Not emptiness, but presence. Moral of the story: sometimes what we seek cannot be spoken or taught, it can only be felt. In the quietest places, beneath form and ritual, peace waits like a whisper under the altar. When we finally listen, not with ears but with the heart, we find what words were never meant to carry. The next story is called The Zen Master's Invisible Ink. In a quiet temple nestled in the mountains, known only to those who listened rather than looked, lived a Zen master who never wrote his teachings down. Students came from far and wide, bringing scrolls, brushes, and empty books, hoping to record his wisdom, but he would simply smile and say, "Some truths are too clear to be seen." One day, a determined young monk arrived, eager to learn and even more eager to preserve. "Master," he said, bowing deeply, "please, just once write a teaching I can carry with me always." The Zen master nodded and said, "Prepare a page." The monk unrolled a clean sheet of rice paper, placed it on the stone table, and handed the master a brush. The master dipped the brush into a clear liquid the monk had never seen before. It looked like water. Carefully, the master began to write, stroke by stroke, with perfect grace. The monk watched closely, but saw no words, no marks. When the master finished, he said, "Take this with you, but do not try to read it in sunlight. Wait for the right time." The monk was confused. The page looked blank, yet he rolled it up carefully and carried it back to his cell. Every day he unrolled the scroll and stared, hoping something would appear, but it remained empty. Frustration grew, doubt followed. He almost threw the scroll away, but something in him held back. He kept it, he watched it, he waited. One night, as rain tapped gently on the window and a candle flickered beside him, he opened the scroll once more. And this time, faint lines shimmered, words appearing as if breathed into light. They were simple. The truth is revealed in quiet moments. What you cannot see when you seek, you will feel when you stop looking. Tears filled his eyes, not just from the words, but from what they stirred in him. The master hadn't written knowledge, he had written a mirror. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always arrive when we chase it. Like invisible ink, truth reveals itself when the heart is still and the light is soft. Peace is not hidden, is simply waiting for the moment when we are quiet enough to see it. The next story is called The Sparrow Who Forgot to Sleep. In the rafters of a quiet Zen temple, nestled between weathered beams and faded prayer flags, lived a small brown sparrow. While other birds flew by day and rested by night, this one did not sleep. Each evening, long after the monks had retired and the last candle had burned out, she remained awake, fluttering from perch to perch, chirping softly to herself beneath the moonlight. The monks noticed her but said nothing. She harmed no one. Yet one young monk, who struggled with his own restless nights, felt a strange connection to her. Like the sparrow, he could not find rest. His body lay still, but his mind flew endlessly from thought to thought, memory to worry, past to future. One night, unable to bear the silence of his own thoughts, he rose from his mat and sat in the courtyard, wrapped in his robe. The air was cool, the stars blinked faintly above, and from the shadows, the sparrow landed nearby, watching him with bright, tired eyes. He whispered, "Why don't you sleep?" The bird tilted her head but gave no answer. Still, her presence was soft, familiar-like, his own restless spirit reflected in feathers. The next morning, he brought his question to the abbot. "There is a sparrow who never sleeps," he said. "She reminds me of myself. I can't quiet my mind. Even when I close my eyes, I am flying." The abbot smiled. "Even birds forget to land sometimes. But they don't fall, they pause on the wind until they remember." He placed a hand on the monk's shoulder and added, "Sleep isn't something you chase, it's something you allow, like still air inviting a wing to fold." That night, the monk didn't try to silence his thoughts. He didn't fight them. He just sat, breathed, listened, and somewhere between breaths, like a feather drifting to earth, he fell asleep. The sparrow, from her perch, finally tucked her head beneath her wing and slept too for the first time in many nights. Moral of the story: rest does not come by force. Like the sparrow, we may forget to sleep when we cling to motion. But when we stop resisting stillness and allow ourselves to land, peace comes naturally, quiet, gentle, and without effort. The next story is called Mountains That Breathe at Night. In a distant land where the stars felt close enough to touch, there stood a range of silent mountains. By day they were still, and proud sharp ridges rising against the blue, unmoving, eternal. But the villagers whispered of something different that happened after the sun went down. They said the mountains breathed. Not with wind, not with sound, but with something deeper, an invisible rhythm felt only in stillness. Travelers who camped nearby reported a strange sensation at night. The earth seemed to pulse softly beneath their mats, as if the mountains exhaled slowly into the sky, then paused before drawing another breath. In a nearby monastery, a young monk had heard these stories since childhood. He was thoughtful and disciplined, but impatient. He longed for deep peace, but each time he meditated, his mind raced. His breath was shallow. He envied the stillness of the mountains and wished he could learn their secret. One evening, overwhelmed by restlessness, he left the temple alone and climbed into the foothills. He carried no food, no cushion, just his robe and his longing. As night fell, he sat on a smooth boulder, surrounded by shadows and silence. At first, his thoughts surged, worries, regrets, memories. He tried to control them, tried to still them. But the more he fought, the louder they became. Then he remembered the story, "The mountains breathe at night." So, instead of resisting, he listened, not to his thoughts, but to the world around him. The wind was faint. The stars held their glow. The stone beneath him felt alive. Slowly, his own breath matched the stillness, not forced, just allowed. In that deep quiet, he didn't hear a sound, but he felt something. A rise, a fall, as if the earth itself was breathing beneath him, guiding him to join. And for the first time, he didn't try to meditate. He simply rested, breathing with the mountains. Moral of the story: stillness is not the absence of movement, but a deeper rhythm we can join. Like mountains breathing at night, peace is not loud or sudden. It's felt in the quiet when we stop struggling and begin to trust the pulse beneath all things. The next story is called A Pagoda Carved from Silence. In a mountain range so high that clouds passed beneath the trees, there stood a pagoda made entirely of stone. But unlike any other temple, this one had no carvings, no paintings, no bells. Each level was perfectly smooth, silent, untouched, unadorned. It had no name, no records in the scrolls, and no monks living within. Yet it was always clean, always peaceful, always waiting. Travelers who stumbled upon it by accident often said the same thing. They felt something shift when they entered. Not fear, not wonder, but a deep and sudden quiet inside themselves, as if the world outside had been turned down and something older had been turned up. One wandering monk, worn by years of study and pilgrimage, arrived at the pagoda during the rainy season. He had followed countless teachers, memorized endless sutras, and recited chants until his voice cracked. Yet still, his heart felt cluttered full of noise that teachings could not reach. When he stepped into the pagoda, something felt different. No statues, no incense, no words, only space, empty, echoing space. He sat on the bare floor, unsure what to do. For the first time in years, he had no instruction, no mantra, no ritual, only silence. At first, the silence roared, his thoughts shouted, memories spilled in, regrets knocked at his chest. But slowly, something softened. The silence didn't push him, it welcomed him. The longer he sat, the more he felt it not as absence, but as presence. A living stillness, older than words, clearer than teachings. Days passed, though he never counted them. He didn't pray. He didn't seek. He simply sat, sometimes breathing, sometimes weeping, sometimes smiling for no reason at all. When he finally rose to leave, he bowed to the space itself, not to a statue, but to the silence that had shaped him. Years later, when others asked what he had learned on his journey, he would answer only this: "I once entered a pagoda carved not by hands, but by quiet. And in its silence, I heard everything I needed." Moral of the story: silence is not the absence of meaning, it is its purest form. When words fall away, what remains is the truth beyond speech. Like a pagoda shaped by nothing but stillness, peace is found not in more, but in less. In the space where nothing speaks, everything is heard. The next story is called When the Buddha Closed His Eyes. Long ago, on a quiet afternoon near the banks of the Ganges River, the Buddha sat beneath a tree with a small group of followers gathered around him. The air was warm, and a gentle wind rustled the leaves like soft whispers. Birds called from far away, and somewhere nearby, a pot was being washed, its rhythm blending with the heartbeat of the land. One of the younger disciples raised his hand with hesitation. He had been carrying a question for many weeks, afraid to ask. "Master," he said softly, "how can you see the truth with your eyes closed?" The Buddha said nothing. He simply smiled and gently closed his eyes. Silence settled over the group like a blanket. At first, the young disciple waited for words, but none came. Just the sound of wind, breath, stillness. The others began to close their eyes too, following their teacher. Minutes passed. The disciple grew anxious. He wanted an answer, he wanted a story, but nothing came. Then, slowly, without trying, he began to notice his breath slowing, the quiet of the earth beneath him, the pulse in his hands. Something soft began to unfold within him, like a door opening without sound. Then he felt it. Not a vision, not a voice, but a deep presence. He didn't need to see anything. He was already inside it. After a while, the Buddha opened his eyes and looked gently at him. "You asked how I see truth with my eyes closed," he said. "But what we see with the eyes is only the surface. The truth lives beneath the surface, like roots beneath soil. When we stop looking outward, we begin to feel what was always waiting inside." The disciple bowed his head, no longer needing an explanation. The answer had not come in words, it had come in silence. Moral of the story: truth is not always visible. It is not found in what we look at, but in what we feel when the noise fades. When the eyes close, the heart begins to see. Peace is not outside. Use it waits in the quiet we so often avoid. When we stop searching, it finds us. The next story is called The Ink-Stained Plum Blossom. In early spring, when the snow was still melting along the stone paths of the temple, a young monk was assigned the task of copying sutras by hand. He worked in the calligraphy hall each morning, where the air smelled of pine, ink, and old paper. The master had given him only one instruction: each stroke must come from stillness. The monk tried to follow this teaching, but his mind often raced. His brush trembled, his thoughts wandered, and his letters lost their shape. He grew frustrated, erasing and redoing until the pages became smudged. He feared he would never master the art of steady writing. One day, as he worked, a gust of wind pushed open the paper door. A single plum blossom, freshly fallen, floated into the room and landed on his scroll. As it touched the wet ink, it absorbed the black pigment and left a stain soft, irregular, and strangely beautiful. The monk gasped. His work had been ruined. The sutra was incomplete, marked by the blot of this unexpected flower. He rushed to the master, holding the stained page with shaking hands. "I have failed," he said. "The wind ruined the writing." The master looked at the blossom, then at the ink mark it had left behind. He studied it for a long while before saying, "It is not ruined, it is honest." The monk stared, confused. The master smiled gently. "Stillness does not mean control. It means allowing what comes." Your brush carries effort, but the blossom carried presence. Look at its mark, it did not hesitate, and it did not try. The monk sat in silence, watching the stain begin to dry into something soft and unique. He suddenly saw that the blossom had done what he could not. It had arrived fully, left a trace, and asked for nothing. From that day forward, his calligraphy changed. Fewer mistakes, fewer corrections, more breath between strokes. And sometimes, on quiet days, he would place a single blossom on the page, not as decoration, but as reminder. Moral of the story: perfection is not found in control, but in presence. Like a blossom that stains the page without effort, beauty appears when we stop trying so hard to be flawless. Peace lives in the honesty of the moment, even when it leaves a mark. The next story is called The Cave That Sang Mantras. In the far reaches of a forest where no paths were marked and only moss remembered the steps of time, there was a cave hidden behind a veil of ivy and stone. It was said the cave could sing not with voices, but with mantras that echoed softly through the air without a single human breath. Travelers who found it told stories of chants rising from the shadows, ancient syllables that seemed to hum within the walls themselves. Some believed it was a sacred place blessed by monks long ago. Others said the cave remembered the prayers spoken inside it and continued to whisper them, like dreams that had learned how to stay awake. One young monk, weary from his training and troubled by self-doubt, set out in search of this cave. He had grown tired of his own mind, tired of the effort, tired of failing to find the stillness others seemed to hold with ease. Maybe the cave will give me peace, he thought. Maybe the mantras will quiet what I cannot. After many days of walking, he arrived. It was smaller than he expected. Simple, cold, dark. He stepped inside and listened. There was no sound. Only his own breath. Only the soft drip of water from a rock above. Only silence. He waited. Minutes passed. Then hours. The cave did not sing. No mantras, no whispers, just emptiness. Frustrated and ashamed, he whispered into the dark, "Why do you sing for others and not for me?" And then, so faintly he almost missed it, the cave answered not with sound, but with reflection. His own voice, that single question, echoed back to him, not louder, but deeper. As it returned, something changed in it. It no longer sounded like pain. It sounded like a prayer. He understood then. The cave never sang alone. It listened. It remembered. It gave back what was given, gently reshaped by silence. He sat, closed his eyes, and whispered a single mantra, not for answers, but for presence. And slowly the cave began to sing. Moral of the story: peace is not something we receive, it is something we co-create. Like a cave that echoes our breath, the world returns what we bring into it. When we speak with sincerity and listen with stillness, even silence becomes song. The next story is called A Teardrop on a Wooden Rosary. In the heart of a mist-covered forest, there stood a humble temple made of cedar and stone, wrapped in ivy and silence. Among the monks who lived there was one who never removed the rosary from his wrist. It was old, its wooden beads, worn smooth by years of use, darkened by time and touch. He carried it everywhere, during meditation, during walking, even in sleep. The younger monks often asked him about it. "Why do you keep using that old rosary?" one of them asked. "The string is frayed, the beads are cracked." The old monk would only smile and say, "It listens better than I do." One night, during a winter retreat, a heavy snow fell, blanketing the forest and the temple in deep silence. The monks sat in long meditation, their breaths soft and visible in the cold air. But the old monk did not sit with them. Instead, he went to the small prayer hall alone and knelt before a wooden statue of the Buddha. His hand moved slowly over the beads. With each one, He breathed not words, not prayers, just the weight of the present. His lips didn't move, but his heart did. A single tear fell from his eye and landed on one of the beads. It shimmered for a moment, then sank into the old wood. The monk paused, hand resting still. That one tear carried years of silent sorrow losses unspoken, burdens carried without complaint, memories that still lived quietly in the corners of his chest. He didn't wipe the tear away. He let it be. The rosary, as always, said nothing, but in its stillness it seemed to hold him, to bear witness. The next morning, the monks found him seated calmly, eyes clear, breath light. When asked what had happened, he simply touched the wet-stained bead and said, "Sometimes the greatest prayer is a single tear that asks for nothing." Moral of the story: true peace doesn't always come through words. Some pain cannot be spoken, it must be felt, held, and released. Like a teardrop on a wooden rosary, our sorrow becomes sacred when we stop hiding it. In allowing it to be seen, we invite healing to begin. The next story is called The Dragon Who Forgot Fire. In the high clouds above a mountain wrapped in mist, there once lived a dragon vast, winged, and ancient. Unlike the tales told in villages below, this dragon did not roar or rage. In fact, it had not breathed fire in many lifetimes. The dragon had forgotten how. It lived in quiet solitude, gliding through fog, sleeping in stone caves, listening to wind. Once worshipped and feared, it now wandered the sky like a drifting cloud. The fire that had once blazed from its chest was gone, and not extinguished, but lost, like a memory that fades gently instead of shattering. One day, a young monk, journeying in solitude through the mountain paths, stumbled upon the dragon resting beside a frozen lake. At first, the monk was afraid, but the dragon didn't move. It only blinked slowly, with eyes that held both eternity and exhaustion. The monk bowed. "You are the great dragon of legend," he said. "Why do you no longer burn?" The dragon exhaled softly. The mist from its breath curled like smoke that had forgotten heat. "I burned for centuries," it said, "for power, for pride, for fear. But when everything around me was scorched, I had nothing left to warm." The monk sat beside the creature in silence, then asked, "And now?" "Now I carry stillness," said the dragon. "It does not light forests or command thunder, but it does not destroy." The monk closed his eyes and breathed with the dragon, feeling a different kind of warmth that didn't rise from flame, but from the calm that followed its absence. As night fell, the dragon curled around the lake like a mountain, embracing its reflection. And the monk, feeling no fear, slept at its side, warmed not by fire, but by the gentleness of what remained when burning ceased. Moral of the story: not all strength is loud. Sometimes true power lies in what we let go of. When anger fades, when the need to prove dissolves, what's left is not emptiness but peace. Like a dragon who forgets fire, we find our true warmth not in destruction, but in quiet presence. The next story is called The River That Never Flowed. In a dry, cracked valley between two silent mountains, there lay the bed of a river that had never flowed. The stones along its path were smooth, the banks curved like a memory of water, and reeds swayed gently where no current passed. The villagers called it the Waiting River. Children played there, elders walked its path, but none had ever seen even a drop of water pass through it. Many asked, "Why does it look like a river, yet carry no water?" Some believed it had dried up long ago. Others said it was a river of spirit, not of earth. But no one knew for certain until a monk came, not to question it, but to listen. He arrived with nothing but a bowl, a robe, and his breath. He did not seek teachings or answers. He simply walked the riverbed from end to end, barefoot, feeling each stone beneath him. Every day, He would sit in the center of the dry channel, eyes closed, back straight, as if he were sitting beside the most sacred stream in the world. One young boy from the village grew curious. "Why do you sit in a place where nothing flows?" he asked. "You could go to a real river, one with sound, with movement." The monk opened his eyes, looked at the boy gently and said, "The water may not come here, but the stillness does." He picked up a small, sun-warmed stone and held it in his palm. "Sometimes what we need most is not what flows, but what waits. This river teaches how to be at peace without needing to move, how to hold space without needing to be full." The boy said nothing, but the next morning he sat beside the monk in the riverbed, and for the first time he heard it not the sound of water, but the deep silence of a place that had accepted its emptiness completely. Years later, when floods finally came to the valley, the waiting river carried water at last. But those who had sat with its silence always said the river had been flowing all along, just not in the way most people looked for. Moral of the story: stillness is not emptiness. A quiet space can hold more truth than noise. Like a river that never flows, peace is sometimes found not in what moves, but in what waits without needing to. In deep stillness, life continues without water. The next story is called A Temple in a Teacup. In a small village known for its quiet mornings and soft rain, there lived a woman who ran a tea house with only 3 seats. She was neither a nun nor a monk, yet travelers often spoke of her tea as sacred. They said something about the way she poured water, held the cup, and paused before each sip felt like a kind of prayer. One rainy evening, a young monk arrived at her door, weary from weeks of walking. His robes were damp, and his thoughts were heavier than his pack. He bowed and asked, "May I have a place to rest?" The woman smiled and gestured to a cushion near the window. She poured hot water into a simple clay pot and set 2 teacups between them. No words, just steam rising into the hush of falling rain. The monk watched her hands. They moved without hurry, without hesitation. The teacup she offered him was chipped, but clean, worn smooth by time. He took it, but before drinking, asked, "Are you a teacher?" She shook her head. "I only pour tea." He sipped. The warmth traveled through him like breath. Something in him softened. He looked around. The room was small, no statues, no scrolls, no altars, just wooden shelves and the scent of leaves. Still, it felt like the most peaceful temple he'd ever entered. He asked, "Why does this place feel so sacred?" She looked at him gently and said, "Because you stopped waiting for something grand. You noticed what was already here." The rain continued. The tea cooled, and for the first time in days, the monk's thoughts rested. He returned to the monastery the next morning without new teachings, without new words, only the memory of a chipped teacup and the silence between 2 sips. Moral of the story: peace doesn't always arrive with bells or robes. Sometimes it waits in small moments, in warmth, in stillness, in the way water fills a cup. When we stop searching for sacred places, we find temples in the ordinary. A simple act, done with presence, can open the heart wider than 1,000 sutras. The next story is called The Footstep That Never Touched Earth. On a narrow path that wound through a mountain forest, pilgrims often walked barefoot as a sign of humility. The trail was worn by generations of feet, some heavy with sorrow, some light with devotion. Near the top of the path stood a stone shrine, and just beside it, carved into the rock, was a single footprint. Unlike the others that disappeared with wind and rain, this one remained perfectly shaped, smooth, untouched by time. And yet, there was something strange about it. It was too delicate, too shallow, as if it had never been made by weight, as if the foot that left it had never truly touched the ground. People called it the footstep that never touched earth. Some believed it belonged to a wandering sage who had reached enlightenment and vanished. Others said it was a mark left by the Buddha in a dream, but none truly knew. A young monk became captivated by it. He visited the footprint every day, kneeling before it in silent wonder. "How can a step leave a mark without ever pressing down?" he often asked. His teacher, noticing his growing obsession, said gently, "The deepest impressions are not made by force, but by presence." One morning, after a long night of restless thoughts, the monk sat beside the footprint and simply breathed. No questions, no chants, just breath. As the sun rose through the trees, a breeze passed through the forest, brushing the leaves and his skin like a whisper. And then, without sound or movement, he understood. The footstep had never touched the earth, not because it lacked weight, but because it lacked attachment. It moved through the world without pressing into it, fully present, yet leaving no harm. It was not a trace of escape, but a symbol of peace so deep that even walking became an act of compassion. He bowed, not just to the mark in the stone, but to the unseen path it pointed to, the one where peace walks softly, leaving no scars behind. Moral of the story: true presence does not demand, nor does it disturb. Like the footstep that never touched earth, peace leaves a mark, not through pressure, but through gentleness. When we move without clinging, we touch the world without wounding it. In that lightness, we find freedom. The next story is called The Laugh That Echoed Through Eons. In a time before calendars and clocks, before empires and borders, there lived a monk in a cave carved high into a mountain's side. He was said to have sat in meditation for so long that moss grew over his robe and birds nested in the folds of his sleeves. Travelers would climb to ask him questions about the universe, enlightenment, and the path beyond suffering, but most returned with silence as their only answer. Until one day, a child arrived. She had no offerings, no sutras memorized, no titles to her name. She simply walked into the cave, stared at the monk, and said with all the curiosity of youth, "What happens when you reach the end of all your questions?" The monk opened one eye, looked at her for a long moment, and then laughed. It was not a quiet laugh. It was not polite. It was wild, sudden, and full of sound that rolled out of the cave like thunder softened by joy. The laugh spilled down the mountainside, startled the goats, stirred the wind, and echoed through the valleys. The girl blinked in surprise, and then, without knowing why, laughed too. They laughed together, not at something funny, not at something broken, but from something that had no name. A release, a remembering, a joy that came not from knowing, but from letting go of the need to know. The monk did not explain. He did not answer her question. He simply smiled, touched her shoulder gently, and returned to stillness. That night, the girl slept at the foot of the mountain, and as the stars turned slowly above her, she felt lighter. Not because she had been taught, but because something inside her had been untied. Years passed, centuries passed. The cave is gone now, swallowed by time. But some say that on certain wind-stirred nights, if you listen closely in the mountains, you can still hear a single distant laugh, warm, free, and echoing across the ages. Moral of the story: sometimes the deepest wisdom is not spoken, it is laughed. When we let go of needing to understand everything, we return to the joy that has always been with us. Peace comes not from finding all the answers, but from realizing we never had to carry every question. The next story is called A Candle in a Snowstorm. In a remote mountain village where winter swallowed sound and snow fell like whispers, there was a tradition passed down for generations. On the longest night of the year, each family lit a single candle and placed it in their window, letting it burn through the dark. No one knew exactly why the tradition began, only that it brought comfort during the silent, freezing nights. In a small temple at the edge of the village, an elderly monk kept the tradition alive. But instead of placing the candle in his window, he walked out into the snowstorm and set it gently in the middle of the courtyard. The flame flickered, barely alive against the wind, yet he sat beside it, unmoving, eyes closed. One year, a young monk watched from the doorway, confused. The snow was thick, the cold bitter. "Why place a candle out there?" he asked. "It will go out. It can't warm anything." The old monk smiled. "The candle is not for light, it is for remembrance." The younger monk said nothing but joined him outside. He wrapped his robe tightly and sat beside the tiny flame, which danced in the wind, refusing to surrender. All around them, the snow fell harder. The sky was colorless. The wind howled softly between the trees. But the candle, though small, though fragile, remained. And as they sat in the storm, something softened inside the young monk. He realized the candle didn't have to win against the cold. It wasn't there to conquer darkness. It was there to remind him that light still exists, even when the world feels frozen. It was not power that gave the candle meaning. It was its willingness to keep burning anyway. When the candle finally flickered out, the old monk bowed his head and whispered, "Even the smallest flame can warm the heart if we are willing to sit with it." Moral of the story: peace does not come from overpowering life's storms, it comes from choosing to remain lit within them. Like a candle in a snowstorm, hope and stillness endure not because they are strong, but because they are present. When we sit quietly with our light, even the coldest night becomes bearable. The next story is called "The Night the Zendo Vanished." There was once a small mountain monastery where the meditation hall, the Zendo, was the heart of everything. Built from cedar and stone, it stood open to the wind, and each morning and evening the monks gathered there in silence. Candles flickered along the walls. Incense curled slowly into the air. The floor creaked beneath bare feet like an old song. Among the monks was a young man who had come to the monastery in search of answers. He believed the Zendo itself held the power he needed. "Here is where I will awaken," he told himself. "Inside these walls, something holy lives." He became devoted to the space. He swept the floors longer than asked. He bowed to the altar more deeply than the others. He never missed a single sitting, and often stayed late into the night, thinking peace must be close if he just sat long enough. One night, heavy clouds covered the stars and the wind howled through the valley. The monks gathered for evening zazen, but just before they began, the mountain shook. A low, groaning sound filled the air. In a matter of seconds, the earth shifted beneath them and the Zendo crumbled. Stone fell, wood snapped. The room where they had found so much stillness was gone. In the dark, the monks stood in silence, surrounded by dust and sky. The wind moved through where the walls once stood. No one was injured, but nothing remained of the space they had loved. The young monk fell to his knees. "How can I meditate now?" he whispered. "Where will we find peace without the Zendo?" The head monk stepped forward, placed a hand on his shoulder, and looked up at the stars now visible through the open air. "The Zendo never gave you silence," he said. "It only helped you remember. It was already inside you." That night, they sat on broken stones beneath the sky. No roof, no candles, just breath, stillness, and moonlight. And in that openness, the young monk felt something deeper than ever before. Moral of the story: the true temple is not built with wood or stone. It lives in the space within us. When the walls fall and the floor disappears, what remains is the real Zendo. Peace is not where you sit, it's how you sit, even when everything around you vanishes. The next story is called "The Moth Who Chanted Om." In a quiet garden behind a hilltop monastery Lanterns were hung each evening as the sun dipped below the mountains. Their soft glow drew all kinds of creatures, crickets, night birds, and sometimes moths that danced in spirals around the light. Among them was one small moth, pale and tattered, who came not to spin and flutter, but to sit still beside the flame. Unlike the others who flapped endlessly, trying to touch the light and often burning their wings, this moth did something strange. Each night, as the monks began their evening chants, the moth would rest on the edge of a lantern and vibrate its wings gently, not flying, not fleeing, but humming softly. It sounded like a faint om. The monks noticed. They watched the moth, puzzled, and one day asked the master about it. Why does that moth not rush to the flame like the others? They wondered. The master simply said, because it already carries the light. One young monk, curious and full of questions, sat near the lantern one evening and observed the moth. He watched the soft rise and fall of its wings, the calm stillness in its tiny body. He tried to copy it, slowing his breath, humming om from his chest. For the first time in days, his restless mind began to settle. He returned every night, and each time, as the moth sat beside the glow, never rushing, never resisting, the monk grew quieter. He began to understand that the chant was not about sound, and the light was not something to chase. One night, the moth didn't come. Perhaps it had died, or moved on. But the young monk sat anyway, humming softly, feeling the warmth of stillness in his chest. He realized the moth had taught him the lesson he couldn't find in books, that peace does not burn brightly and fast. It hums gently, endlessly, when you no longer need to chase the flame. Moral of the story: peace is not found by reaching toward the light, but by becoming still beside it. Like the moth who chanted Om, calm arises when we stop rushing, stop clinging, and rest in our own quiet glow. What we seek is already within us, waiting to be remembered. The next story is called A Garden Without Flowers. In the center of a quiet village stood a garden unlike any other. There were no roses, no lilies, no blossoms of color or scent, just stones, raked in careful circles, smooth paths lined with moss, empty space that seemed to hold something invisible. People called it the garden without flowers. Many passed it by, thinking it bare, unfinished, or forgotten. But every morning, a monk came to tend it. He swept fallen leaves with great care. He rearranged the stones when rain softened the ground. He walked slowly, as if each step grew the garden further even without petals. One day, a traveler came through the village and watched the monk work. Curious and slightly amused, he approached. "Why tend a garden that never blooms?" he asked. "What joy is there in a place without fragrance or color?" The monk smiled and paused. He gestured to the smooth raked sand and said, "Because this garden blooms in silence. It does not speak in petals, it speaks in peace." Still unsure, the traveler sat for a while, watching nothing happen. And in that nothing, he began to notice everything. The whisper of wind through bamboo, the cool breath of earth beneath the stones. His own heartbeat slowing, as if matching the stillness before him. He had visited gardens all over the world, chasing beauty, fragrance, and awe. But here, with nothing to dazzle his senses, he felt something deeper. A calm that did not ask for attention. A quiet that asked for presence. He stayed longer than he planned. Not to see something change, but to let something inside him settle. When he finally stood to leave, he bowed low. "I understand now," he said softly. "Some gardens don't bloom outward, they bloom within." Moral of the story: not all beauty wears color, not all peace arrives with music or bloom. Sometimes stillness is the most generous teacher. Like a garden without flowers, true calm asks nothing from the world, only that we sit and see and listen to what needs no words. The next story is called The Sutra Written in Breath. In a monastery perched above a sea of clouds, there lived a monk known not for his chanting voice or scholarly knowledge, but for his silence. While others recited the sutras aloud each morning, his lips never moved. He sat with the others, eyes closed, hands resting gently in his lap, breathing slowly deeply as if each breath were a word and each pause a verse. Some of the younger monks grew curious. One finally asked the abbot, "Why doesn't he chant with us? Does he not honor the teachings?" The abbot smiled and said, "He is chanting, just not in the way you expect." That evening, as golden light spilled through the windows, the curious monk approached the silent one. "What sutra do you follow?" he asked. "I've never seen your scroll." The silent monk opened his eyes and placed a hand over his heart. "It is written here," he said quietly, "with breath." He explained that years ago his voice had failed him after an illness. At first, he mourned the loss of his chanting, felt useless, broken, incomplete. But one dawn, as he sat outside and watched the fog drift over the hills, he began to breathe with intention. Slowly, fully, as if each inhale was the beginning of a sacred line, and each exhale its completion. He realized the teachings were not bound to ink or sound. They could be lived through presence. With every mindful breath, he honored impermanence. With every still moment, he echoed compassion. With every pause, he understood emptiness. The curious monk sat beside him, joining him in silence. Together they breathed, and as they did, something soft unfolded between them. No words, no chant, just a deep and unshakable peace. That night, the younger monk rolled up his sutra scroll before finishing it. He sat by the open window, closed his eyes, and let his breath carry the teachings forward. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always need words. Like a sutra written in breath, peace is found in how we live, not just in what we say. When we breathe with awareness, we speak the oldest truth softly, silently, and completely. The next story is called The Cloud-Shaped Master. In a highland village surrounded by rice fields and sky, there was a tale passed down through generations about a mysterious Zen master who never stayed in one place and never left a name behind. They called him the Cloud-Shaped Master because no one could describe him the same way. Some said he was tall, others short. Some swore he was young, while elders insisted he was ancient. But all agreed on one thing: wherever he went, he brought a feeling of deep calm that lingered long after he left. No records of his teachings existed, no scrolls, no students who followed him. Yet stories of quiet transformations followed his path. A weaver laid down her loom and finally forgave her brother. A farmer sat beneath a tree and cried for the first time in years. A soldier buried his sword and built a shrine in its place. One day, a young seeker heard of the master and became determined to find him. He traveled across valleys and rivers, asking each village, each temple, "Have you seen the cloud-shaped master?" Sometimes he heard, "He was just here, and now he's gone." Sometimes he left no name, only silence. The seeker grew tired, his feet blistered, his mind restless. One evening, he sat on a hill and looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted slowly through a golden dusk. He began to cry, not out of sadness, but from a deep weariness he couldn't name. "I've searched for so long," he whispered. "I only wanted to learn peace." Just then, a soft voice spoke beside him, though he hadn't noticed anyone arrive. "You searched for a cloud, but forgot the sky it floated in." The seeker turned. A figure sat beside him, plain robe, calm face, eyes like quiet water. "You carry the master you seek," the figure said, "but you look only outward. True teachers come like cloud shifting, formless, never staying. but their lesson is not in their shape. It is in the space they reveal. When the seeker looked again, the figure was gone. Only the clouds remained. Moral of the story: not all teachers wear robes or give names. Some come like clouds, gentle, changing, and free. Peace is not always taught directly. It arrives in moments that pass through us and show us the vast sky within. When we stop chasing shapes, we begin to feel the space that holds them. The next story is called The Cat Who Understood Karma. In a quiet Zen temple nestled between rice fields and a winding river, there lived a temple cat named Kiko. She was small and grey, with sharp eyes and slow, graceful movements. The monks often joked that she was more mindful than many of them, for she never rushed, never scratched, and always knew when to appear, especially during meals. Kiko was more than just a cat. She was part of the temple's rhythm. She sat in the meditation hall without needing to be told. She wandered the gardens without disturbing a single stone. And though she never spoke a word, the monks swore she understood everything. One day, a novice monk, frustrated after being scolded for breaking a bowl, sat outside alone, arms crossed and heart burning with resentment. Kiko padded up to him, purring softly, and curled herself at his feet. The monk sighed. "I didn't mean to drop it. It wasn't fair." Kiko looked up, blinked slowly, then walked over to a patch of dry earth nearby. With one soft paw, she dug a small hole. The monk watched, confused. Then she picked up a pebble in her mouth, dropped it into the hole, and gently pushed the earth back over it. She turned, sat, and stared at the spot. The monk frowned. "What are you doing?" An older monk who had been sweeping the path nearby smiled. "She's teaching," he said. "That's how she buries what doesn't need to follow her." The novice looked at the small mound of earth. "But it was just a pebble." The elder nodded. "Yes, and you're holding a broken bowl in your heart. Karma isn't just about what comes back, it's also about what we choose to carry forward." Kiko yawned, stretched, and wandered off, her tail flicking lightly in the air, as if to say, "Let it go." From that day, whenever the novice felt anger or guilt rise, he would imagine burying a pebble beside Kiko's spot, and in time, he began to walk lighter. Moral of the story: karma is not just consequence, it is also choice. We are shaped not only by what happens, but by how we hold or release it. Like the cat who knew when to let go, peace begins the moment we stop carrying what no longer serves us. The next story is called The Wind That Spoke in Bells. In a small cliffside temple overlooking the ocean, bells were hung from every corner, small bronze bells, glass ones shaped like droplets, wooden ones carved from hollow branches. They never rang by hand. The monks believed that only the wind should move them, and so each bell remained silent until nature decided it was time to speak. One young monk, new to the temple, found this tradition puzzling. He had come seeking wisdom, structure, answers. But every time he asked a question, the senior monks would point to the bells and say, "Wait for the wind." Frustrated, he walked the grounds day after day, growing impatient. "How can I learn," he muttered, "if no one speaks?" One evening, as the sun began to dip into the sea, a storm approached. The sky darkened and wind rushed up the cliff, wild and full. The bells, silent for days, began to chime. Not in unison, not with rhythm, but with feeling. Some rang softly, others sang out sharply, and still others trembled with a sound so delicate it barely reached the ear. The young monk stood in the middle of the courtyard, surrounded by voices made of metal, wood, and sky. For the first time, he did not think, he only listened. The sound was not like speech, but it carried truth. It said, "Everything moves when it's ready. Everything speaks in its own time, and silence too is a sound." As the wind faded, so did the bells. One by one, they stilled. The courtyard returned to quiet, but something in the monk had changed. Later, he asked the abbot, "Who tuned the bells to sing like that?" The abbot replied, "No one. They only ring when they are moved by something greater than themselves." The monk bowed his head and finally understood why no one answered his questions directly. The teachings had always been there waiting for him to stop demanding and start receiving. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always arrive in words. Like bells moved by wind, truth appears when we are still enough to hear it. Peace is not foresaid, it is felt, in moments when we allow life to speak through silence, sound, and everything in between. The next story is called The Shoeless Pilgrim. There was once a pilgrim who walked from village to village without shoes. His feet were scarred and weathered, soles toughened by years of stone, heat, and cold. People often offered him sandals or boots, but he always declined with a gentle bow. "The earth teaches me more than comfort ever could," he would say. He carried no possessions, only a wooden staff and a small cloth bag. He slept beneath trees, drank from rivers, and bowed to every doorstep, not to beg, but to offer blessings. Some mocked him. Others called him mad. Yet wherever he passed, silence seemed to follow, like a soft echo of something long forgotten. One day, he arrived at a temple where the monks were debating a difficult teaching from the sutras. They were caught in words, interpretations, and theories about suffering and its cause. The abbot, noticing the pilgrim resting beneath a tree nearby, called to him, "You, traveler, what do you know of suffering?" The pilgrim stood, walked slowly to them, and raised his foot. The sole was cracked, blistered, and bleeding. "This," he said softly, "and still I walk." The monks fell silent. The abbot asked, "How do you continue without pain stopping you?" The pilgrim looked at the sky, then back to the earth. "Pain touches the body," he said, "but suffering begins when the mind clings to it. I feel every step, but I do not carry it." He smiled, bowed, and turned to leave, his bare feet pressing lightly into the soil. The monks watched him disappear down the path, his presence lingering like a breath. That evening, the youngest monk removed his sandals before walking to evening meditation. The stones were sharp, the ground cold, but somehow his heart felt warmer. Moral of the story: true freedom does not come from avoiding pain, it comes from walking with it gently, without attachment. Like the shoeless pilgrim, peace is found not in what we protect ourselves from, but in how lightly we walk through what we meet. Each step, no matter how rough, can be a doorway to awakening. The next story is called A Bowl Left for the Moon. At the edge of a small forest clearing, where the trees opened just wide enough to reveal the full sky, an old monk performed the same ritual each month. On the night of the full moon, he would take a simple clay bowl and place it in the grass, directly beneath the open sky. He filled it with clear water from the well and sat beside it in silence. He never explained why. The other monks watched, curious. Some thought it symbolic, others thought it was an offering, but the old monk only smiled and said, "It is not for the moon, it is for the reflection." One evening, a younger monk finally asked to sit with him. "What are you hoping to see in the water?" he asked gently. "The moon is above, not in the bowl." The old monk nodded, then pointed to the surface of the water. The moon's perfect reflection floated there, still and glowing. "We do not always meet truth by looking up," he said. "Sometimes we must look down, quietly, into stillness." As the night deepened, a breeze stirred. The water rippled, and the moon's reflection shattered. The younger monk gasped, saddened to see the image lost. But the old monk only closed his eyes and whispered. The moon did not disappear, only the water forgot how to hold it. They sat in silence, waiting. Slowly the breeze passed, and the bowl grew calm again. The moon returned, whole and untouched. The younger monk's heart softened. He realized that the bowl was not about ceremony or worship. It was a mirror. And the moonlit was not some distant light, but the mind's own clarity, only visible when undisturbed. After that night, he too would leave a bowl out each full moon, not to catch light, but to remember that stillness reveals what reaching cannot. Moral of the story: peace is not found by grasping at distant truths, but by creating stillness within. Like a bowl left for the moon, the mind must be quiet to reflect its own light. What we seek is not beyond it is waiting to be seen in the calm water of presence. The next story is called The Brushstroke of Stillness. In a quiet studio behind the walls of a Zen temple, there lived an old calligraphy master who painted only once a day on stroke on one sheet of paper in absolute silence. He never signed his work, never explained it. Each morning he would sit, breathe, dip his brush, and let it glide across the paper in a single fluid motion. Then he would bow, let the ink dry, and burn the paper before sunset. Visitors came from far away to watch, hoping to learn the secret of his art, but they left with more questions than answers. Why burn something so beautiful, they asked. Why only one stroke? The master never replied. He only smiled, as if their questions were too loud to hear the answer. One day, a young artist arrived at the temple. He was skilled, ambitious, and deeply frustrated. His paintings were praised by many, yet he felt empty when he looked at them. Too much effort, too much noise. Nothing ever felt finished. He begged the master for guidance. "Teach me how to create peace with a brush," he pleaded. The master nodded and handed him a brush. "Paint a line," he said. The young artist dipped the brush and drew a sweeping line bold, elegant, impressive, but the master shook his head. Again. This continued day after day. The artist grew more tired, more humble, less concerned with style. His strokes became softer, simpler, until one morning, something shifted. He lifted the brush, exhaled, and moved it without hesitation or performance, no doubt. The master bowed. "Now burn it." The artist hesitated, but this one felt right. The master smiled. "That's why we burn it, because stillness is not to be kept, it is to be lived. You found it not in the image, but in the motion." From then on, the artist painted fewer lines, and each one was enough. Moral of the story: true peace is not found in the result, but in the presence behind the action. Like the brushstroke of stillness, beauty appears when we stop trying to impress and begin to move with honesty. Letting go is the final art. What we do in stillness leaves no trace but transforms us completely. The next story is called A Bird Who Slept on Sand. On a quiet stretch of coastline where the waves whispered instead of crashing, there lived a small white bird who had no nest. While other birds built their homes in trees or cliffs, this one returned each evening to the same patch of sand, tucking herself into a shallow dip just above the tide's edge. The villagers noticed her, always alone, always calm. "She'll be swept away," they warned. "The sea is too close." But every morning she was still there, unmoved, untouched, as if the ocean had chosen to leave her in peace. One day, a young monk on retreat walked the shoreline, lost in thought. He had come to the coast, hoping to find silence, but even in the temple by the sea, his mind roared regrets, fears, unfinished conversations. He could not sleep, he could not sit still. When he saw the little bird resting in the sand, so near the tide, he was struck by its vulnerability. "How can she sleep there?" he whispered aloud. "Doesn't she fear the waves?" That night, the monk stayed near the shore, unable to rest. The tide crept in slowly, covering rocks and reaching for the line of sand where the bird had curled into herself. The water came closer still, but stopped just before touching her. The moonlight glowed softly on her feathers. She did not stir. In that quiet moment, the monk understood. The bird trusted the sea, not because it was safe, but because fear had no place in her rest. She did not need walls to sleep. She had presence. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the waves move through him, not over him, not against him, but through him. That night, he slept for the first time in weeks with nothing to hold him but breath and sky. Moral of the story: true peace is not found by building stronger shelters, but by softening into trust. Like the bird who slept on sand, we find rest not by avoiding life's tides, but by lying gently within them. Stillness is not the absence of danger, it is the quiet courage to stay open anyway. The next story is called The Path, Beneath the Path. In a monastery surrounded by forests and winding trails, there was one path that all monks followed to reach the meditation hall. It curved gently through trees, across stone steps, and over a small stream. Every morning before dawn, the monks walked it in silence, their robes whispering across the ground. But after a long season of rain, the path became muddy and uneven. Stones shifted, roots emerged, walking became difficult. The younger monks stumbled, slipping often, muttering quietly about the mess beneath their feet. One morning, as they complained among themselves, the abbot stopped at the edge of the trail. He bent down and placed his hand on the wet earth. "You're walking only the surface," he said, "but the path you need is beneath it." The monks looked confused. "What path?" one asked. "All we see is mud and roots." The abbot stood and smiled. "Then you're starting to see." He led them off the trail and into the woods. At first, there was no clear direction, only moss, fallen leaves, and silence. But as they walked, they began to notice a faint line between the trees. A soft, natural trail, not man-made, but worn slowly by deer, wind, and time. It was narrower, quieter, but easier to walk. It bent with the forest instead of cutting through it. "This is the path beneath the path," the abbot said. "It's not marked by stone, it's revealed by awareness." That day, the monks learned to walk with their eyes not just on the ground, but on everything around it. They saw how the land spoke, how silence shaped the way forward, how walking was not just movement but attention. Later, when they returned to the old path, they walked differently, not hurried, not annoyed. Each step softer, each breath deeper. Moral of the story: the path we walk is not always the one we see. Beneath frustration, beneath struggle, there is often a quieter way revealed, not by effort, but by presence. Like the path beneath the path, peace is found when we slow down, look again, and follow the quiet guidance life always offers. The next story is called The Lake That Never Reflected. High in the northern mountains, hidden beneath layers of cloud and silence, there was a lake unlike any other. Its surface was always dark, never glassy, never still. Even on windless days, it rippled gently, as if stirred by something from within. Travelers called it the lake that never reflected. No trees bent over it, no birds skimmed it, and no stars danced upon its surface. Some believed it was cursed. Others said it was too deep, too old to show anything but shadow. But one wandering monk, seeking rest from his long journey, came to the lake with no judgment. He sat beside it, watching the endless movement of its waters. He saw no sky in it, no face staring back, only motion, only depth. A local shepherd passed by and saw the monk meditating. "Why sit here?" he asked. "This lake has no reflection. It offers nothing to see." The monk opened his eyes, soft with stillness, and said, "That is exactly why I sit here." He explained, "Most waters show us what we expect ourselves, the world, a surface image. But this lake refuses to flatter. It offers no echo. It doesn't return our face. Instead, it asks us to see without seeing. As the monk returned to silence, the shepherd stood confused, then walked on. But the monk stayed. In the days that followed, he sat by the lake each morning and evening, and slowly something changed, not in the lake, but in him. Without his own image staring back at him, his thoughts quieted. There was nothing to analyze, nothing to compare, no reflection to hold on to, only the endless, gentle movement of water. He began to feel peace, not from seeing something beautiful, but from no longer needing to see anything at all. Years later, he would tell others about that lake, not with awe, but with reverence. "It didn't show me who I was," he would say, "but it showed me how to let go of the need to know." Moral of the story: peace is not always found in clear reflections. Sometimes it is found in what does not reflect at all. Like a lake that never mirrors the world, true stillness asks us to release the image and rest in the presence beneath it. In that depth, there is nothing to grasp, only freedom. The next story is called The Shadow of Enlightenment. In a high monastery wrapped in clouds and wind, there was a stone room where monks went to meditate alone. In that room, nothing was allowed: no scrolls, no beads, no incense. Just a mat, a single candle, and the flickering shadows it cast on the walls. One monk, young and determined, believed he was close to enlightenment. He had read every sutra, memorized every chant, and fasted until his body felt lighter than air. Yet still, something was missing. He entered the stone room, convinced he would find the final answer there. As he sat cross-legged before the candle, its flame danced softly, and his shadow stretched long behind him. He watched it flicker, then tried to ignore it. But it kept drawing, his eyes shifting, bending, always following. Hours passed. He grew restless. "If I am nearing light," he whispered, "why does the shadow still follow me?" In frustration, he turned and faced the wall, trying to escape the shape behind him. But still, the outline moved with him, silent, soft, always present. The abbot, passing by, noticed the flicker under the door and entered quietly. Seeing the monk tense and uneasy, he sat beside him in silence. Then, after some time, he said, "You cannot chase light without inviting your shadow." The monk looked at him, confused. The abbot continued, "Enlightenment is not the absence of shadow. It is the willingness to sit beside it without fear." He then reached out and cupped the candle flame briefly with his hand, casting no shadow at all. When you try to hold the light, your shadow disappears, but so does the flame. The monk finally understood. His shadow was not a sign of failure, but a sign he was walking toward light. It followed not to haunt him, but to teach him. He bowed deeply, not to the candle, but to the shadow on the wall behind him. Moral of the story: our shadows are not flaws, they are reflections of our light. To walk the path of peace is not to destroy what follows us, but to understand it. Like the shadow of enlightenment, our deepest fears soften when we stop running and learn to sit with them gently. The next story is called The Monk Who Dreamed of Snow. In a temple nestled deep within a valley of green and gold, snow was rare. Winters came gently, with mist and cold wind, but snowflakes had not touched the earth there for many lifetimes. Still, one monk, quiet and aging, spoke often of snow, as if he knew it intimately. He told the younger monks stories of snow that whispered instead of falling, of silence so deep it echoed in the heart, of a world wrapped in white where nothing rushed, nothing needed to be done. But he had never seen snow with his eyes, only in dreams. Every few weeks, he would wake before dawn and walk barefoot to the temple garden, closing his eyes and lifting his face to the sky. The younger monks would watch from the doorway, puzzled by the ritual. "There's no snow," they said quietly, "only cold air." One day, a new student asked him, "Why do you long for what never comes?" The old monk looked at him gently and replied, "I don't long for snow, I remember it." The student laughed nervously. "But you've never seen it." The monk smiled. "Not with these eyes, no, but in stillness, sometimes the soul remembers places the body has never been." That evening, as the monks gathered for meditation, a hush fell over the valley. Clouds thickened, and the air grew heavy with silence. Without warning, the first snow in 100 years began to fall slow, soft, like drifting prayers. The ground held its breath. The monks rushed outside, filled with wonder and joy. But the old monk stayed seated, eyes closed, unmoving. When they told him it was finally snowing, he opened his eyes, tears resting quietly on his cheeks. "I know," he said. "It's just as I remembered." Moral of the story: not all knowing comes from seeing. Some truths live deep within us, waiting for stillness to awaken them. Like snow in a land that has forgotten winter, peace can return without warning, soft and silent. Trust what the heart remembers 7 if the world has not yet seen it. The next story is called The Gate Made of Questions. At the entrance to a small forest shrine stood an unusual gate. It was made not of wood or stone, but of countless wooden tablets, each carved with a question. Some were simple, "Who am I?" Others were quiet riddles. "Where does the wind go when it stops?" A few were so worn, their words had nearly vanished. Travelers would stop before passing through, reading the tablets with furrowed brows. Some laughed, some sighed. A few turned back, unable to walk beneath something that didn't offer clear answers. A young monk, weary from searching for truth in scrolls and sermons, came to the gate one evening, just as the sky turned the color of ashes. He read the first question, "What carries you when your legs are tired?" He smiled bitterly. "I don't know anymore," he whispered. Then the next, "What do you cling to when you let go?" He paused. Something stirred inside him, not an answer, but a feeling, a softness. He kept reading. Each question slowed his breath, unraveled a knot. None gave him a path, but none pushed him away. An old caretaker, sweeping leaves nearby, noticed the monk lingering. "You don't have to answer to pass," he said, "but you cannot pass unchanged." The monk looked up. "Who built this gate?" The old man replied, "No one. It builds itself every time someone stands before it." The monk stepped forward slowly. As he passed beneath the hanging questions, he felt no resistance, only a strange, quiet permission to not know. For the first time in his practice, he didn't need certainty. He simply bowed to the mystery and walked on. In the forest beyond, the wind felt different, the silence deeper, the path gentler. Moral of the story: peace is not found in having all the answers. It blooms when we stop demanding them. Like the gate made of questions, life invites us not to solve everything, but to walk humbly with what we do not yet understand. In the space between questions, stillness begins. The next story is called The Leaf That Refused to Fall. In the garden of a quiet Zen temple stood a maple tree that had seen many seasons pass. Each year, in autumn, its leaves would turn brilliant shades of gold and red before floating gently to the earth. The monks loved this, time-raking the fallen leaves into soft piles, breathing in the scent of change. But one year, a single leaf clung stubbornly to the highest branch. Long after the others had fallen, long after the frost had come, this small, withered leaf remained. One young monk noticed it during his morning walking meditation. Day after day, he looked up and saw it trembling, barely attached, refusing to let go. He grew curious and mentioned it to the abbot. "There is one leaf that will not fall," he said. "It's as if it's afraid." The abbot nodded, then walked with him to the tree. They stood in silence, watching the lone leaf sway in the cold wind. "We're not so different," the abbot said softly. "Some of us fall easily, some hold on, even when it's time." The young monk furrowed his brow. "But wouldn't letting go be more peaceful?" The abbot smiled. "Sometimes, yes, but even the act of holding on has its own teaching." They returned to the temple. The young monk began to reflect on what he himself was clinging, told regrets, unspoken fears, memories he thought he had released but hadn't. That stubborn leaf became a mirror. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. One morning, after a long night of snowfall, the monk stepped outside. The leaf was gone. Not fallen in a gust, not torn away, but released, gently, as if it had finally said yes to the wind. He stood beneath the tree, not sad, but still. He whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure if he meant the leaf or what it had helped him see. Moral of the story: letting go doesn't always happen quickly. Like the leaf that clings to the branch, we all carry things we're not ready to release. Peace comes not by forcing surrender, but by allowing it to arrive when the heart is ready. In the right moment, even the most stubborn part of us can float gently to rest. The next story is called The Zen of a Broken Spoon. In the kitchen of a small mountain temple, monks prepared their meals with care and mindfulness. Every bowl, knife, and ladle was washed, dried, and returned to its place as if each item were a sacred teaching. Among these tools was a wooden spoon, old and worn, with a deep crack running down its handle. Most would have thrown it away long ago, but one monk used it every day, even though newer ones sat unused on the shelf. The younger monks noticed. "Why keep something broken?" they asked. "Why not choose what is whole?" The monk smiled and said, "This spoon has taught me more than any that was ever perfect." Years earlier, he had broken it himself, by mistake. In frustration, he nearly threw it into the fire. But something in its shape, the way it curved to fit his hand, the warmth of the wood, stopped him. Instead, he wrapped a thin cord around the crack and kept using it. It reminded him of the chant he once whispered during hard times: "Even this mistake, even this crack, even this moment." One day, while stirring rice, the spoon finally split in two. A young monk rushed to bring him a new one, but the older monk placed the broken spoon gently on the table and said, "Let's eat first." After the meal, they sat together. The monk held the broken spoon in his palm. "This spoon and I cooked many meals together. It was never perfect, but it never needed to be. I learned patience from its fragility. I learned care from its flaw." He then leaned in and whispered, "Sometimes what is cracked holds the most silence." The young monk didn't forget. Later that evening, he found the spoon resting beside the fire, not burned, not discarded, honored. Moral of the story: wholeness is not the absence of flaw, but the presence of acceptance. Like the zen of a broken spoon, peace arises not from what is untouched, but from how we hold what has been changed. When we stop fearing what is imperfect, we begin to understand what it truly means to care. As we reach the end of this journey, let your breath settle like morning mist over a still pond. You've walked through stories not of noise, but of stillness. From a teacup that waited, to a sparrow's final question, to a bell that echoed only in silence, each tale was a gentle lantern guiding you back to yourself. These Zen and Buddhist teachings do not demand answers. They invite you to soften, to release, to remember that peace is not something we chase, it is something we uncover beneath the rush, the ache, the wanting. If a story touched you, or a single image lingered like moonlight on an empty pillow, share it below. Let us know which teaching spoke to your heart. Your words may become someone else's moment of stillness. And if you'd like to continue walking this quiet path with us toward deeper rest, clarity, and calm, subscribe to the channel. More wisdom waits, softly, just ahead. Now rest, let go, and let sleep find you, like a candle gently flickering out in a snowstorm.